My parents disowned me after I spent every dollar of my inheritance restoring the farm they called worthless. I survived 3 brutal years alone until a developer offered $46 million and revealed the secret my parents had hidden beneath that land. Before I tell you how I turned their greed into my greatest victory, take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories about standing up for yourself. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back to the exact moment my family showed me who they truly were. I was standing in the middle of a withered cornfield in upstate New York. The late autumn wind was biting through my canvas jacket, but I barely felt the cold. I was staring at my phone screen, reading a text message from my mother. It was just 7 words. "You are no longer my daughter." My hands shook as I locked the screen and slid the phone into my pocket. I was 31 years old. I had spent the last 8 years working as an internal auditor for a mid-sized accounting firm in Albany, living a quiet and predictable life. I spent my days looking for discrepancies in corporate ledgers, tracking missing funds, and exposing financial waste. I was very good at seeing what people tried to hide. It is a bitter irony that I never applied that analytical skill to my own family until it was too late. In the space of a single week, everything I thought I knew about my family, my future, and my own worth had been completely shattered. And it all started with my grandfather, Henry. Grandpa Henry was the only person in the world who ever looked at me and saw someone capable. While my parents fawned over my younger sister, Chloe, Grandpa would take me out to his farm. It was a massive, sprawling 500-acre property nestled against a thick tree line. To my parents, it was a dirty and unprofitable embarrassment. To me, it was a sanctuary. I spent my childhood summers learning how to fix tractor engines, understanding crop rotation, and sitting on the wooden porch, listening to him talk about the legacy of the land. He always said the land gives back exactly what you put into it. It was a lesson my family never understood. When Grandpa Henry passed away suddenly from a massive stroke, the entire family gathered in a sterile lawyer office in downtown Syracuse for the reading of the will. I was absolutely devastated. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching a crumpled tissue, just wanting to hear his name one last time. My parents, Richard and Barbara, sat front and center. They were pillars of the local Presbyterian church, the kind of people who cared infinitely more about how they looked in the Sunday pews than how they treated people in private. My father was an elder who passed the collection plate with a solemn nod, and my mother organized the charity bake sales, ensuring everyone knew exactly how much she had donated. Beside them sat Chloe and her husband, Bradley. Chloe was a real estate agent who spent more time buying designer handbags than actually selling houses, and Bradley was a corporate lawyer with a slick smile and cold eyes that always seemed to be calculating your net worth. The lawyer cleared his throat and read the terms. To my sister, Chloe, Grandpa left his vintage car collection. To my parents, he left his extensive investment portfolio, and then the lawyer turned to me. To his eldest granddaughter, Clara, he left $300,000 in cash and the entirety of the 500-acre farm. The room went dead silent. I was stunned. I never expected anything. I just wanted my grandfather back. But the silence from my family was not born of shock or grief. It was born of absolute outrage. My father, Richard, was the first to speak. His face flushed a deep, angry red as he leaned forward in his leather chair. "There must be a mistake," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet office. "Henry knew Clara is just an auditor. She does not know the first thing about running a commercial agricultural property. That farm is a massive liability." The lawyer adjusted his glasses and confirmed there was no mistake. The assets were legally mine. I walked out of that office feeling the heavy weight of grief and the sudden, terrifying responsibility of my grandfather's legacy. But my family did not give me even 24 hours to mourn in peace. The very next evening, I was summoned to my parents' house. I walked into their pristine living room, the one with the expensive white couches nobody was ever allowed to actually sit on, and found an intervention waiting for me. Richard, Barbara, Chloe, and Bradley were all sitting together. They looked like a united front, a solid wall of judgment. "Have a seat, Clara," my father ordered. He did not ask how I was holding up. He did not offer me a glass of water. He just pointed to a hard wooden chair opposite them. "We need to talk about the farm," my mother Barbara began. Her tone was that fake, syrupy, sweet voice she used when she was trying to manipulate the church council. "We know you are overwhelmed, sweetheart. Inheriting a massive failing property is a terrible burden for a single woman. We want to help you fix this." I looked at her genuinely confused. "Fix what I asked. Grandpa left it to me. I plan to keep it." Chloe let out a loud theatrical sigh, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Clara, do not be ridiculous. You cannot run a farm. You crunch numbers in a cubicle all day. You do not have the stamina or the capital. Bradley and I have been talking, and we have the perfect solution." Bradley adjusted his designer tie and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He put on his best corporate lawyer face, using the same condescending tone he probably used to intimidate opposing counsel. "Clara, let us be practical here. The farm is in terrible shape. There are back taxes owed. The equipment is ancient. It is a bottomless money pit. You need to sell the land immediately. Take the cash from the sale and combine it with the $300,000 Henry left you. And do what with it?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster against my ribs. "You transfer it to Chloe and me," Bradley said smoothly without missing a single beat. "Chloe wants to start her own luxury real estate brokerage. The market is incredibly hot right now. We need seed money. You give us the $300,000 and the cash from the farm sale, and we will give you a tiny percentage of the brokerage profits once we get off the ground. It keeps the wealth in the family." I sat there completely frozen, trying to process the sheer audacity of what they were demanding. I looked at my sister. She was nodding eagerly, already envisioning her name on a shiny glass office building. I looked at my parents. They were smiling in agreement, as if stripping me of my entire inheritance to fund Chloe Vanity Project was the most logical and righteous thing in the world. "You want me to sell Grandpa Legacy?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You want me to sell the place he loved more than anything and just hand you all the money?" "It is not just handing it over." Chloe snapped her friendly facade, cracking instantly. "It is an investment. Do you want me to be successful or not? I am your sister. You should be supporting my dreams. You do not even have a husband or a family to provide for. What do you even need $300,000 for?" The sheer entitlement took my breath away. But then again, it was always exactly like this. Growing up, if I got a new bicycle for my birthday, Chloe would cry until my parents made me give it to her because she wanted it more. If I won an academic award, my parents would hide the certificate in a drawer so Chloe would not feel inadequate about her own grades. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself so my sister could shine. And now they were casually demanding my grandfather the final gift to me. My mother chimed in, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "Clara, this is what family does. We sacrifice for each other. Chloe has a real future ahead of her. Bradley has connections in the city. They are going to build an empire. You staying on that rotting farm is just a waste of resources. Do the right thing. Honor God by helping your sister. Honor God." She always used religion as a weapon when she wanted her way. But Grandpa Henry had not left the farm to Chloe. He had left it to me. He had trusted me. He knew I was the only one who actually cared about the soil, the timber, the old wooden house with the wraparound porch. He knew my parents would pave over it in a heartbeat for a quick payout. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to stand tall and square my shoulders. No. The word hung heavily in the air. The fake smiles vanished from my parents' faces. Bradley stopped looking smug. Chloe dropped her jaw in absolute disbelief. "What did you say?" my father demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumbling growl. I said no. I repeated louder and firmer this time. "I am not selling the farm, and I am definitely not giving you the $300,000. It is my inheritance. Grandpa left it to me, and I am going to keep it." Chloe burst into tears. Real loud, heaving sobs. "Mom, She cried out, pointing a manicured finger at me like I had just physically attacked her. She's ruining my life. I need that money for the brokerage. You promised me she would give it to us. You promised her. I stared at my mother in absolute disgust. You promised her my money before I even walked into this room. My father stood up. He was a large man, and he used his physical presence to intimidate anyone who dared to defy him. He walked right up to me, his face inches from mine, his eyes blazing with fury. You listen to me, Clara. You are making a massive mistake. You are going to fail. You are a mediocre accountant, and you will be a pathetic farmer. You are going to drain that $300,000 in a single year, and you will come crawling back to us begging for a handout. We are giving you a chance to be part of something successful with your sister. Do not be a stubborn, selfish fool. I am not being selfish, Dad. I am respecting Grandpa's wishes. He wanted the farm to stay intact. Henry was a sentimental old fool. My father spat the venom in his voice, making me step back. And you are just like him, blind to reality. That land is a pile of garbage. The soil is depleted. The barn is falling apart. It is a worthless piece of trash, and you are throwing your entire life away for it. I did not back down. I looked my father straight in the eye, channeling every ounce of courage I had left. It is my life to throw away. I turned and walked out of the house. I could hear Chloe wailing behind me. I could hear my mother yelling my name, demanding that I come back and apologize for disrespecting them. I did not turn around. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to the only place that felt like home, the farm. When I pulled up the long dirt driveway in the dark, the reality of what I had inherited finally hit me. My father was not entirely wrong about the physical condition of the place. The paint on the farmhouse was peeling away in large gray strips. The wooden fences were broken and rotting. The fields were overgrown with thick weeds. It looked like a monumental, impossible task, but it was mine. I went inside the dusty farmhouse, turned on the single working lamp, and opened my laptop. I logged into my bank account. The $300,000 from the estate had cleared that very morning. I knew that as long as that money sat in my checking account, my family would hound me for it. They would manipulate, guilt trip, and harass me until they broke my spirit. There was only one way to make them stop. I had to make the money completely untouchable. I pulled up the county tax portal online. Grandpa had fallen behind on property taxes during his final years of declining health. There was an active lien warning on the property. The back taxes and penalties totaled almost $45,000. Without a second of hesitation, I typed in my routing number and paid the entire balance in full. Next, I called a local agricultural supplier and left a detailed voicemail with my credit card information. I ordered commercial-grade winter wheat seed pallets of high-yield fertilizer and bulk soil amendments to restore the nitrogen levels in the depleted dirt. I emailed a local roofing contractor and prepaid for a complete overhaul of the main barn roof. I wired a massive deposit to a heavy equipment dealer for a refurbished tractor. I paid the electric and water companies a year in advance. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I had spent exactly $285,000. The money was gone. Reinvested directly into the dirt my father had called worthless. I sat back in my chair and watched the sunrise over the fields. I felt a profound sense of peace. I was exhausted, terrified of the hard labor ahead, but completely and utterly free. That afternoon, the storm finally hit. I was standing in the cornfield assessing the rusted irrigation lines when my phone started ringing endlessly. My mother, my father, Chloe, Bradley. The screen lit up over and over again. I ignored all the calls. Then the text messages started pouring in. Chloe texted me a long string of vicious insults, calling me a jealous, bitter spinster who wanted to ruin her happiness out of spite. Bradley texted me legal threats claiming I was violating some imagined verbal contract and that he would sue me for the funds. And then came the message from my mother. It popped up on my screen, cold and final. "We know you spent the money." Bradley pulled the public tax records. "You are a spiteful, vindictive girl. You chose a pile of dirt over your own flesh and blood. You are no longer my daughter. Do not contact us again." I stood there in the withered cornfield, holding the phone. The wind whipped my hair across my face. My own mother had just erased me from her life because I refused to be an ATM for her favorite child. A single tear slipped down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away. I looked out over the 500 acres of land. It was quiet. It was peaceful. And for the first time in my 31 years of life, I was entirely alone. I did not know it then, but my parents disowning me was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. It meant they were not looking over my shoulder. It meant they were not paying attention to what I was doing. And it meant they had absolutely no idea what was actually hidden beneath the soil of this worthless farm. The next 3 years would push me to the brink of physical and mental exhaustion. I would face sabotage, isolation, and a town that turned its back on me. But I refused to break. The real war had just begun. The morning after I paid the property taxes, I woke up to a strange and heavy silence. My phone, which normally buzzed constantly with updates from my family, was completely still. I sat up in my bed and reached for the device. The screen was dark. I unlocked it and opened my messages. Our family group chat had been a constant presence in my life for years. It was where my mother shared her daily Bible verses. It was where my father complained about the weather. It was where my sister Chloe posted endless photos of her expensive coffees and designer shoes. I tapped the icon. A small gray box appeared at the bottom of the screen. "You have been removed from this conversation." I stared at those words for a long time. They were just pixels on a screen, but they felt like a physical blow to the chest. My own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, had pressed a button and erased me from her digital life. It was a clean surgical excision. I checked my social media accounts. My mother had unfriended me. My father had blocked me. Chloe had not only blocked me, but she had deleted every single photograph of us together from her profile. I was gone. I spent the next hour sitting on the edge of my bed, wrapped in a blanket, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. They were punishing me. This was their way of showing me that obedience was the only currency they accepted. Because I refused to hand over my inheritance to fund my sister luxury real estate project, I was no longer a member of the family. But the silent treatment was only the beginning. My family was not content with merely ignoring me. They needed to destroy my reputation so that they could play the victim. The first sign of their smear campaign arrived on Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of packing my apartment in Albany, putting my accounting textbooks into cardboard boxes when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Higgins. She was a sweet older woman who had known me since I was a little girl in Sunday school. I answered the call, hoping for a friendly voice. "Clara," she said, her voice thick with fake concern. "I am so sorry to hear about your mental breakdown." I dropped the roll of packing tape. My heart started pounding against my ribs. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Higgins?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your mother told the church prayer circle everything. She said you are not in your right mind. She said you manipulated your poor grandfather on his deathbed and stole all the money he meant to leave to Chloe." Mrs. Higgins paused, waiting for me to defend myself. She said, "You are having a psychotic episode and that you bought a worthless farm because you are not taking your medication." Medication. Psychotic episode. Stole the money. The lies were so massive and so perfectly tailored to make them look like helpless victims that it literally took my breath away. The sheer audacity of the lie was paralyzing. I had spent 8 years meticulously auditing corporate ledgers, ensuring every single cent was accounted for. I lived my entire life by the rules of honesty and precision. And now, my own family was painting me as a delusional thief. My mother had taken my grandfather's dying wishes, my financial responsibility, and my independence, and twisted them into a narrative of mental illness and theft. I realized then that I was not just fighting my family. I was fighting an entire community that had known me my whole life, but would always believe the wealthy, respected church elders over the quiet, single daughter. I told Mrs. Higgins that none of it was true. I told her I was fine, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. She promised to pray for my soul. I hung up the phone and cried until my eyes were swollen. By the time Sunday morning arrived, I had a choice to make. I could stay hidden in my apartment, packing my boxes and running away like a guilty person, Or I could put on my best clothes drive to the Presbyterian church and show them that I was not crazy, not a thief, and not afraid. I chose to fight. I chose to show up. I put on a tailored navy blue dress. I styled my hair carefully. I wore the small pearl earrings my grandfather had given me for my high school graduation. I looked like the successful, rational adult that I was. I drove the familiar route to the church, my stomach churning with every mile. This was the place where I had been baptized. This was the place where I had sung in the youth choir. This was the community I had thought of as my extended family. I parked my car and took a deep breath. The morning air was crisp and clear. I walked up the heavy stone steps of the church. The massive wooden double doors were propped open. The familiar smell of old paper and polished wood washed over me. Usually, walking into the foyer was a loud and joyful experience. People would stop to shake hands, to ask about my job, to comment on the weather. Today, the moment I stepped across the threshold, the noise stopped. The cheerful chatter of the congregation died down to an uncomfortable hush. I smiled and nodded at the greeter, a man named Mr. Peterson, who had known me for 20 years. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," I said clearly. He looked at the floor, handed me a Sunday bulletin without meeting my eyes, and turned his back to me. It was deliberate. It was cold. I gripped the paper program and walked into the main sanctuary. The stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the wooden pews. The organist was playing a soft prelude. As I walked down the center aisle, I felt the physical weight of hundreds of eyes on me. I saw heads turning. I heard the whispering. It sounded like the hissing of snakes. I caught snippets of their conversations. "There she is. How can she show her face? Poor Barbara. I hear she took every penny." The words hit me from all sides. These were people who had eaten casseroles at my table. These were women I had helped with charity bake sales. These were men who had praised my accounting skills just a month ago. I recognized Mr. Henderson, the choir director who had taught me to sing. I saw Mrs. Gable, whose taxes I had filed for free just 3 months ago. They all looked away. The betrayal stung worse than the cold winter wind. And now, because my mother had spun a web of lies, they were looking at me like I was a monster. They had convicted me without a trial. I kept my head high. I kept my shoulders back. I refused to let them see me break. I walked all the way to the front of the church. My parents always sat in the very first pew on the right side. It was their throne. It was where they could be seen by everyone. I approached their pew. My father, Richard, was wearing his best charcoal suit. My mother, Barbara, was wearing a pristine white dress. Chloe and Bradley were sitting right beside them, looking like the perfect, wealthy young couple. I stood at the edge of the pew, waiting for them to slide over and make room for me. They knew I was there. I could see the tension in my father's jaw. I could see my mother's hands gripping her Bible until her knuckles turned white. But they did not move. They did not turn their heads. They stared straight ahead at the empty pulpit. They were passing me by as if I were completely invisible. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. The entire church was watching. My mother adjusted her silk scarf perfectly, ignoring the daughter standing 2 feet away. My sister Chloe leaned over and whispered something to Bradley, and they both smirked. They were enjoying this. They were enjoying my public humiliation. They wanted me to break down. They wanted me to cry and beg for their forgiveness so they could prove their narrative that I was unstable. But looking at their rigid backs, their fake piety, their absolute lack of love, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. Why was I fighting for a seat at a table where I was hated? Why was I seeking the approval of people whose love was conditional upon my financial submission? My grandfather Henry had not left me the farm so that I could be chained to this toxic performance. He had left me the farm so that I could be free. The pain in my chest dissolved. The fear vanished. I did not need them. I did not need this church. I did not need their conditional smiles. I dropped the Sunday bulletin on the floor. The paper made a soft slapping sound against the wood. My father twitched, but still refused to look at me. I turned around and faced the congregation. The whispering stopped instantly. Hundreds of guilty eyes darted away from mine. I walked back up the center aisle. My steps were slow and deliberate. I held my head higher than I ever had in my life. I was not walking away in defeat. I was walking away in victory. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright Sunday sunlight. The air tasted cleaner outside. I got into my car and drove away from the church, and I never went back. The next 2 weeks were a blur of intense physical and emotional labor. I broke my lease in Albany. I packed my entire life into a rented moving truck, and I drove out to the farm. I knew the property was in bad shape, but seeing it again as its sole owner was a harsh reality check. The main farmhouse was completely uninhabitable. The roof had caved in during a winter storm 2 years ago, and the floors were rotted. But there was a smaller structure on the property. An old dilapidated log cabin near the edge of the woods that my grandfather had used as a hunting lodge decades ago. It had no central heating. The plumbing was ancient. The windows were drafty and coated in years of grime. I pulled the moving truck up to the cabin and turned off the engine. The silence of the country wrapped around me. There were no sirens. There were no gossiping church members. There were no text messages from angry parents. There was just the wind rustling through the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of the cabin and pushed it open. The smell of dust and old wood hit me. Cobwebs hung from the rafters. The floorboards creaked under my boots. It was dark and cold and completely empty, but it was mine. I did not sit down and cry. I rolled up my sleeves. I grabbed a broom and a bucket of soapy water, and I started scrubbing. I scrubbed the floors until my knees bled. I washed the windows until the afternoon sun poured into the small room. I unpacked my boxes one by one. I set up a small cot in the corner. I arranged my accounting books on a dusty wooden shelf. I found an old cast-iron wood stove in the center of the room and spent hours figuring out how to clean the chimney and build a fire. By the time the sun went down, the cabin was clean. It was still freezing, and I still had no internet and barely any cell service. But a fire was crackling in the stove, casting a warm orange glow against the log walls. I heated up a can of soup on a small portable camping stove. I sat on the edge of my cot, eating my soup out of a plastic bowl. My muscles ached. My hands were blistered. I was 31 years old, living in a wooden shack in the middle of nowhere, without a family, without a support system, and without a safety net. I had spent nearly $300,000 of cash on seeds, fertilizer, and tractor parts that were being delivered next week. I had nothing left but the dirt under my boots and the iron will in my heart. I walked out onto the small wooden porch of the cabin. The night sky was incredibly clear. Millions of stars glittered above the dark silhouette of the tree line. I thought about my parents, sitting in their pristine living room, watching television and congratulating themselves on putting me in my place. I thought about Chloe dreaming of her luxury real estate office. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought that cutting me off and ruining my reputation would force me to come crawling back on my hands and knees, begging to give them my inheritance. They severely underestimated the endurance of a woman who has finally stopped trying to please her abusers. I took a deep breath of the freezing night air. The cold filled my lungs, making me feel more alive than I had felt in years. The betrayal hurt deeply. I cannot deny that the rejection from my own mother and father left a permanent scar on my soul. But scars are just proof that a wound has healed. This was the true beginning of my isolation, but it was also the birth of my total independence. No more fake smiles. No more draining my energy to fund their perfectly curated lives. Just the raw, honest reality of the soil and the seeds. I was entirely alone, but I was finally safe. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. I had 500 acres of dying land to bring back to life. I had a farm to rebuild, and I had a fortune to grow. They wanted me to be a failure. I was going to be their greatest nightmare. Spring arrived in upstate New York, not with a gentle thaw, but with a bitter, stubborn chill that clung to the damp earth. I had spent my first few months in that drafty log cabin, simply trying to survive the freezing nights. But as the ground finally began to soften, I threw myself into the brutal reality of agricultural life. The heavy equipment dealer delivered the refurbished tractor I had paid for. The supplier dropped off massive pallets of winter wheat seed and fertilizer. For a woman who had spent the last 8 years sitting in a climate-controlled office staring at spreadsheets, the physical shock was absolute. My hands, once manicured and soft, became heavily calloused and cracked from the freezing mud. Every muscle in my back and shoulders screamed in agony at the end of each day. Yet as I drove that green tractor back and forth across the sprawling 500 acres, turning the dark soil and planting my very first crop, I felt a profound sense of purpose. I was breathing life back into my grandfather's legacy. I was putting my inheritance into the ground, and I was going to watch it grow. But I was dangerously naive. I thought my family had done their worst by disowning me and destroying my reputation at the church. I thought that by leaving them behind, I had bought myself the right to be left alone in peace. I did not realize that greedy people do not just walk away when you deny them what they want. They change their tactics. They move into the shadows. The first sign of trouble started in late April. In the first year, the crops mysteriously failed, but the failure did not begin with the soil. It began at the perimeter. I woke up one morning just as the sun was breaking over the tree line to a strange rustling sound coming from the lower 40 acres. I threw on my heavy canvas coat and boots and marched down the dirt path. A massive herd of wild deer was grazing freely in my newly planted fields, trampling the delicate green shoots I had worked so hard to cultivate. I ran toward them, shouting and waving my arms until they scattered back into the dense woods. My heart sank as I surveyed the damage. Thousands of dollars of potential harvest had been crushed into the mud in a single night. I grabbed a toolkit from the barn and began to walk the mile-long perimeter fence, expecting to find a section that had simply rotted away or collapsed under the weight of a fallen branch. Instead, I found something that made the blood freeze in my veins. The heavy gauge wire had not snapped from age or animal pressure. The fences were constantly being cut, allowing wild animals to invade and destroy the crops. I knelt in the wet grass and ran my thumb over the severed metal. It was a perfectly clean shear. Someone had taken a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters to my fence line, and they had not just cut it in one place. As I spent the next 4 hours walking the entire property, I found 6 different deliberate breaches. Someone had spent hours in the dark, methodically opening my farm to the wilderness. I repaired the damage myself in the biting cold of New York. My knuckles bled as I wrestled with the sharp, unyielding wire, trying to pull the tension tight. The wind whipped across the open fields, slicing through my layers of clothing. I was entirely alone, wrestling with heavy steel posts and rusted chains, but I refused to stop until every single hole was sealed. I began to suspect sabotage, but the local police did not intervene due to lack of evidence. I drove into town the next morning and walked straight into the county sheriff precinct. I sat across the desk from a deputy I had known since high school. I explained about the clean cuts, the obvious use of tools, the targeted nature of the damage. He leaned back in his squeaky leather chair and gave me a patronizing smile. He told me that teenagers often messed around in the woods doing stupid pranks. He asked if I had any security footage. I told him I did not have internet access or the money to install a massive perimeter camera system. He closed his notepad and said there was simply nothing he could do. I realized as I walked out of that station that my father played golf with the sheriff. My father was a respected church elder. I was the crazy, estranged daughter who was allegedly having a mental breakdown. The law in this small town was never going to protect me. If the cut fences were a warning, the next attack was a death blow. By early June, the weather had finally turned warm. The surviving wheat was beginning to grow tall and strong. I had spent days meticulously clearing the old irrigation channels that drew water from the large reservoir pond at the back of the property. I fired up the massive diesel pump and watched with pride as the water began to flow through the pipes, nourishing the thirsty fields. It was the hardest I had ever worked in my life, and for a brief fleeting moment, I thought I was actually going to make it. I thought the harvest would be enough to cover my operating costs for the next year. 3 days later, I walked out to the fields and stopped dead in my tracks. The lush green stalks of wheat were turning a sickly, violent shade of yellow. The leaves were curling inward, crisp and dead. I dropped to my knees and scooped up a handful of the damp soil. A sharp, harsh chemical odor burned the inside of my nose. It smelled like industrial poison. Panic seized my chest. I ran the full half-mile back to the reservoir pond. As I got closer, the smell grew overpowering. The surface of the water was covered in a faint, oily film that shimmered with an unnatural rainbow hue in the afternoon sunlight. Clara discovered that the irrigation system had been poisoned with herbicide. Someone had driven a truck up the back logging road under the cover of darkness and dumped hundreds of gallons of commercial-grade weed killer directly into my water supply, and I had just pumped that poison across hundreds of acres of my own crops. I fell to my knees in the dirt beside the toxic water. I could not breathe. I was a former auditor. My brain immediately began calculating the financial devastation. The seeds, the fertilizer, the fuel, the labor, all of it was gone. More than half of the $300,000 I had invested was now literally dead in the soil. I could not harvest this. I could not sell this. The land would need to be tested and remediated. I pressed my dirty hands against my face and let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. It was a sound of absolute primal despair. They wanted to break me. My family wanted to drain my resources until I was completely bankrupt, until the bank foreclosed on the property, or until I was forced to sell it to their anonymous company for pennies on the dollar. They knew exactly how much money I had inherited, and they were calculating exactly how much damage it would take to bleed me dry. That night, the atmosphere in the log cabin changed. The terrified, weeping girl who had sobbed by the poisoned reservoir was gone. The setting is depicted through Clara, sleepless nights, her hunting rifle by her bedside, her body covered in bruises, but her will growing stronger. I sat in a wooden rocking chair by the front window, bathed in the pale light of a full moon. The shadows of the pine trees stretched long and dark across the yard. I did not turn on the lamps. I wanted my eyes adjusted to the dark. I wanted to see them if they came back. Across my lap rested my grandfather's old hunting rifle. It was heavy and made of cold steel and polished wood. I had cleaned it, oiled it, and loaded it. I did not sleep. I stared out into the darkness, listening to the wind, listening for the sound of a truck engine or the crunch of boots on gravel. My physical reflection in the window glass was almost unrecognizable. I had lost 15 pounds from the relentless physical labor and the stress of rationing my meager food supply. My arms and legs were a canvas of dark purple and yellow marks. Every bruise told a story of a slipped wrench, a falling fence post, or a stumble in the rocky dirt. My body was covered in bruises, but my will was growing stronger. I realized that night that I was no longer fighting for a farm. I was fighting for my dignity. I was fighting for the right to exist in a world without being manipulated and drained by the people who shared my blood. They thought that destroying my crops would make me pack my bags and surrender. They thought that cutting my fences would make me feel vulnerable and weak. They profoundly misunderstood the kind of woman they had created. I spent the rest of that summer and the brutal autumn that followed in a state of hypervigilance. I learned how to sleep in 2-hour shifts. I learned how to string invisible fishing line across the access roads attached to empty tin cans that would rattle if anyone tried to drive onto the property. I became a ghost haunting my own land. I stopped going into town unless it was absolutely necessary. I stopped looking at the pitying faces of the church members who passed me in the grocery store aisles. I lived on canned soup and cheap rice, hoarding every single remaining dollar in my bank account. I audited my own life with the same ruthless precision I had once used on corporate tax returns. I cut every unnecessary expense. I sold my grandfather vintage furniture to an antique dealer 3 towns away just to pay for a new water filtration system for the cabin. The isolation was a heavy physical weight. There were weeks where the only voice I heard was my own. The silence of the New York winter began to creep in, freezing the ground solid and covering the dead poisoned wheat fields in a blanket of pristine white snow. The cold seeped through the logs of the cabin, no matter how much wood I chopped for the cast iron stove. but the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice that was forming around my heart. I knew my father was sitting in his warm, perfect house, drinking expensive scotch and waiting for the phone to ring. He was waiting for me to call him, sobbing and begging for a bailout. He was waiting for me to admit that I was a failure, that a woman could never run a commercial agricultural property alone. He was waiting for me to agree to sell the land to his son-in-law shell company, just to escape the crushing debt. I stroked the smooth wooden stock of the hunting rifle. I watched the snow fall outside my window. "Let them wait," I whispered to the empty room. They had taken my family, they had taken my reputation, and they had taken my first harvest. But they had not taken the land. The deed was still in my name. The taxes were paid. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I was not going to give them a single square inch of this dirt. I was going to survive this winter. I was going to find a way to finance the next planting season, even if I had to fight the entire town to do it. The shadows outside the cabin seemed to press closer, but I did not shrink away from them anymore. I belonged here. I was the master of this ruined farm, and I was ready for whatever hell they planned to unleash on me next. The brutal winter finally released its icy grip on upstate New York, giving way to the muddy and unpredictable spring of my second year on the farm. Surviving that first year had drained me physically and mentally, but it had also severely depleted my bank account. The initial inheritance was gone. It had been buried deep in the soil, invested in crucial roof repairs, and spent on heavy equipment just to keep the property from collapsing into complete ruin. As a former internal auditor, I knew exactly where I stood financially at every moment. I kept meticulous spreadsheets, tracking every single penny I spent on diesel fuel commercial seed and nitrogen fertilizer. I audited my own life with the same ruthless precision I had once applied to corporate tax returns. I knew that to survive the upcoming planting season and keep the farm operational, I needed a significant injection of working capital. In her second year, Clara needs an agricultural loan to survive. I was not looking for a handout or a favor. I was looking for a standard agricultural operating loan. This is the exact kind of financial bridge that commercial farmers rely on every single spring to purchase supplies before the fall harvest brings in revenue. My personal credit score was absolutely immaculate. I had zero personal debt, no outstanding credit card balances, and a highly detailed business plan that projected a modest but steady profit by October. I spent 3 long nights sitting at my worn kitchen table by the light of a single bulb, printing out cash flow projections, soil analysis reports, and market price averages. I placed every single document into a crisp black binder. I wanted to walk into the bank, not as a desperate, estranged daughter, but as a highly competent business owner who knew the value of her assets. On the morning of my appointment, I pulled out the only professional outfit I had not sold or ruined during my months of hard labor. It was a tailored charcoal gray blazer and a matching skirt that I used to wear to corporate board meetings in Albany. When I put the clothes on, they hung loosely on my frame. I had lost so much weight from the relentless physical work and the strict rationing of my grocery budget that I looked like a stranger wearing someone else's garments. I had to use safety pins to gather the waistband of the skirt just so it would stay up. I brushed my hair, polished my sensible black shoes, and tried to scrub the permanent stains of dark soil from under my fingernails. I looked at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. I looked tired, but my eyes were sharp. I grabbed my black binder, locked the heavy wooden door of the log cabin, and climbed into my battered farm truck. The drive into town took 40 minutes. The transition from the wild, overgrown edges of my property to the perfectly manicured lawns of the town center was always a jarring experience. This was the town where my parents were treated like royalty. This was the town that had turned its back on me after my mother spread lies about my mental health. I parked my rusted truck down the street from the bank, hoping it would not draw too much attention among the shiny new sedans and luxury vehicles. The local bank was an imposing brick building with large glass windows and polished brass handles. Walking through those heavy doors felt like stepping back into a world I no longer belonged to. The air conditioning was crisp and biting. The marble floors were spotless. The subtle smell of expensive cologne and fresh coffee floated in the air. I walked up to the receptionist desk and asked to see Mr. Abernathy, the branch manager. I sat in a plush velvet chair in the waiting area, holding my black binder tightly against my chest. My hands were rough and heavily calloused, resting against the fine wool fabric of my blazer. I saw a few older couples from my former church walk through the lobby. When they noticed me sitting there, they quickly averted their eyes, pretending they were deeply interested in the deposit slips on the counter. I ignored them completely. I kept my head high and my shoulders back. I was not here to seek their approval. I was here to secure the future of my farm. Finally, the heavy oak door to the manager office opened. Mr. Abernathy stepped out and motioned for me to come inside. He was a balding man with a flushed red face and a nervous habit of constantly adjusting his silk tie. I walked into his spacious office, which smelled strongly of leather polish, and sat down across from his massive mahogany desk. I did not waste any time with small talk. I opened my black binder and handed him the executive summary. I walked him through the numbers clearly and professionally. I showed him the immense equity I had in the land. I showed him the complete lack of liens or hidden debts. I laid out my expected crop yields based on the new irrigation system I had installed. I spoke with the confidence of an auditor who knew that her math was absolutely bulletproof. But as I spoke, I noticed that Mr. Abernathy was barely looking at the papers. He kept shuffling them back and forth across his desk, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He picked up his pen, put it down, and cleared his throat loudly. I felt a cold knot begin to form in the pit of my stomach. I knew that look. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision long before I sat down in his chair. "Clara," Mr. Abernathy finally said, pushing the black binder back across the smooth surface of the desk. "Your numbers are very thorough. You have always been excellent with accounting, but I am afraid we cannot approve this loan application." I stared at him in complete disbelief. I asked him why. I reminded him that I owned 500 acres of prime agricultural land outright. I had massive collateral. I had a perfect credit history. I had zero debt. There was absolutely no financial reason to deny an operating loan of this size. She goes to the local bank where Richard often plays golf with the manager. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My father and Mr. Abernathy had been golf partners at the country club for over a decade. They drank expensive scotch together every single weekend. They sat on the same community charity boards. My father had reached him. He wiped his sweaty forehead with a white handkerchief and looked out his window. "It is not about your credit history, Clara. It is about the zoning. Her excellent credit history is suddenly rejected due to planning risk. There are some serious concerns at the county level about future developments in that area. We just cannot take on a property with that kind of planning risk right now." It was a complete and utter fabrication. There were no zoning issues on a farm that had been agricultural land for a century. My father had made a phone call. He had casually mentioned over a game of golf that his daughter was unstable, that she was guaranteed to fail, and that the bank should not throw good money away. My own family was actively choking off my air supply. I did not yell. I did not cry. I picked up my black binder, stood up from the leather chair, and looked Mr. Abernathy straight in the eye. I told him I understood exactly what was happening. I turned and walked out of his office. The bright midday sun practically blinded me as I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the bank and stepped back out onto the concrete sidewalk. The warm spring air felt suffocating, pressing down on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I stood there for a long moment, gripping my binder so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The realization that my father would actively sabotage my financial survival just to force me into submission was a bitter poison to swallow. I felt a wave of absolute exhaustion wash over my entire body. I had fought the freezing weather. I had fought the wild animals. I had fought the poisoned soil. But how could I possibly fight an entire town network that answered directly to my wealthy parents? I started walking slowly toward my rusted farm truck parked down the street, trying to figure out how I was going to buy seed for the upcoming week. The sound of a heavy engine broke my concentration. As soon as she steps out of the bank, Bradley, her brother-in-law, pulls up in his luxury SUV. The massive, gleaming black vehicle glided to a perfectly smooth stop right beside the curb, intentionally blocking my path to the crosswalk. The dark-tinted window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Bradley leaned over from the driver's seat. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire first harvest. His hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place, and his teeth were blindingly white. He looked just like the absolute picture of corporate success and arrogant wealth, completely detached from the dirt and the brutal struggle of the real world. "Clara?" He called out, his voice practically dripping with artificial warmth and fake concern. "What a coincidence seeing you here in town today." It was absolutely no coincidence at all. The bank manager had undoubtedly texted him the exact moment I walked into the lobby. They were hunting me. They were working together in a coordinated effort to herd me into a desperate financial corner. I stopped on the sidewalk, refusing to step any closer to his expensive vehicle. I kept my face blank and asked him exactly what he wanted. Bradley turned off the engine and stepped out of the luxury SUV. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and walked toward me, putting on a highly practiced face of deep, brotherly concern. "We have been incredibly worried about you, Clara. The whole family is worried. We know things are getting very difficult out there on that ruined farm. We know you are struggling to make ends meet and pay the bills." I stared at him with cold eyes. I told him firmly that I was doing just fine and did not need his concern. He let out a soft, highly patronizing laugh that made my blood boil. "Come on, Clara. You do not have to lie to me. You just walked out of that bank looking like your entire world collapsed. We know you desperately need money. We know Mr. Abernathy turned you down for the operating loan." The sheer breathtaking audacity of the situation paralyzed me for a second. They had actively arranged my financial rejection, and now they were waiting right outside on the sidewalk to play the generous savior. He made a rescue offer from his family. Bradley reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. He held it out toward me, but I kept my arms strictly at my sides. "I have a permanent solution for you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, persuasive pitch, like he was negotiating a corporate merger. "A clean break from all this misery. No more struggling in the freezing mud. No more begging local banks for money to buy cheap seeds. An asset management company called Apex Holdings, LLC, was willing to buy the farm for $150,000. I looked at the white envelope resting in his manicured hand. $150,000. That was exactly half the amount she had paid. I had sunk nearly $300,000 of cash into repairing the main roof, buying the heavy tractor, purchasing commercial fertilizer, and paying off the massive back taxes. They knew exactly how much cash I had spent, and now they wanted to steal the entire property for exactly half its value, leaving me completely bankrupt and humiliated. This is a very generous offer. Clara Bradley continued smoothly, stepping just a little closer so the people walking past us on the sidewalk would not hear the details of our conversation. Apex Holdings is willing to completely overlook the poor condition of the soil and the rotting old buildings. They will take it off your hands for pure cash today. You can take the money, move back to a small apartment in Albany, and get a nice, quiet accounting job again. You can put this whole embarrassing farming episode behind you and start over. I looked at his perfectly clean hands. I looked at his shiny leather shoes. I felt the rough, painful calluses on my own palms. The quiet anger that had been simmering inside my chest suddenly turned into a cold, diamond, hard focus. They had intentionally created this severe financial crisis, and now they were offering a solution that would completely ruin me while enriching them. I asked him directly who owned Apex Holdings, LLC. Bradley blinked rapidly, clearly, not expecting me to ask technical questions about corporate structures. He shifted his weight slightly on the concrete. "It is just a standard corporate buyer, Clara. An anonymous investment group. They buy distressed properties all over the state. It does not matter who owns the company. What matters right now is that this is your only way out of a total disaster." Bradley gave a fake smile. His lips curled up perfectly at the edges, creating the illusion of kindness, but his eyes remained flat, calculating and entirely cold. "Your parents told me to help you get out of this debt. Don't be stubborn anymore, Clara." The word stubborn echoed loudly in the warm spring air between us. To my family, my fierce daily survival was just stubbornness. My refusal to be emotionally broken was just an annoying inconvenience to their grand plans. They wanted me to bow my head in defeat, take their incredibly insulting offer, and admit that I was absolutely nothing without their money and their approval. They wanted to buy my beloved grandfather legacy for pennies and turn around to sell it for a massive fortune. I realized in that exact moment that this entire ordeal was never about my mental health. This was never about me being a foolish woman trying to be a farmer. This was a highly calculated, predatory financial strike designed to strip me of my inheritance. I looked at the crisp white envelope. I looked at Bradley's smug, punchable face. I felt the heavy black binder under my arm, filled with the undeniable numbers that proved the land was incredibly valuable and worth saving. I told him in a voice that was barely above a whisper to take his generous offer and burn it. Bradley dropped his fake smile instantly. His face turned a dark, angry shade of red. "You are making a huge mistake, Clara. You have no money left. You have no credit in this town. You are going to lose that entire farm to foreclosure by the end of the year, and you will walk away with absolutely nothing. This is the very last time this family is going to offer you a lifeline." I stepped carefully around his expensive shoes. I told him he was not family. I told him he was a parasite. Clara refused and drove away in her old truck. I walked straight to my rusted vehicle, opened the heavy squeaking metal door, and climbed inside the cab. The engine sputtered loudly twice before finally roaring to life, puffing a thick cloud of gray exhaust smoke into the pristine street. I put the heavy gear shift into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving Bradley standing frozen on the sidewalk in his expensive suit, clutching his worthless white envelope. I looked in the cracked rearview mirror and watched him shrink into the distance. I had no bank loan. I had no money for the upcoming planting season. I was driving back to a massive farm that was bleeding me dry every single day. But as I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, I did not feel defeated. I felt dangerous. They had tried to trap me in a corner, but all they had done was show me their hand. I was going to find a way to survive this second year, even if I had to tear the earth apart with my bare hands. The war was far from over. The transition from autumn to winter in my third year on the property was not a gradual cooling of the earth. It was a violent and brutal assault. In the third year, a harsh winter arrived. The sky above the farm turned a permanent shade of bruised purple, and the freezing wind howled across the open fields with a ferocity that physically shook the heavy wooden logs of my small cabin. I had spent the entire spring and summer battling the lingering effects of the poisoned irrigation system and the deliberately severed fences from the previous year. Through sheer stubborn exhaustion and relentless physical labor, I had managed to scrape together just enough of a minimal harvest to pay my property taxes and keep the basic utilities running. I truly believed the worst of the sabotage was finally behind me. I thought my family had realized that their petty vandalism was not going to break my spirit and that they had finally moved on. I vastly underestimated the dark depths of their greed and the absolute ruthlessness of their strategy. They were no longer trying to simply discourage me from farming. They were actively trying to completely annihilate my physical and financial ability to survive. The main barn was the beating heart of the entire farm operation. It was a massive, beautiful wooden structure that my grandfather Henry had built with his own hands decades ago. It housed my refurbished green tractor, my remaining winter seed, all of my heavy repair tools, and the expensive replacement parts I had purchased for the irrigation pump. It was my fortress against the freezing elements and the foundation of my future planting season. On a bitterly cold night in late January, I woke up suddenly in the pitch dark. The wind was screaming outside the cabin, but there was another terrifying sound underneath it, a heavy, deep crackling noise that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. I smelled thick, acrid smoke seeping through the drafty cracks of my cabin windows. Panic seized my chest. I threw off my heavy wool blankets, pulled on my work boots without any socks, and ran out into the blinding, driving snow. The sky above the farm was glowing a terrifying, violent shade of orange. My barn caught fire under suspicious circumstances. The flames were leaping 30 feet into the freezing night air, devouring the dry, ancient timber with an insatiable, roaring hunger. The heat radiating from the massive inferno was so intense, it instantly melted the snow in a massive circle around the structure, but the air temperature pressing against my back was far below freezing. I stood there, shivering violently, completely helpless as the fire consumed everything I owned. The local volunteer fire department arrived 40 minutes later, but there was absolutely nothing they could do except spray freezing water on the surrounding ground to keep the massive blaze from spreading to my nearby cabin. I stood in the wet slush and watched every single piece of equipment I relied on turn into white, hot, glowing ash. When the sun finally rose over the blackened, smoking ruin the next morning, my auditor brain automatically began calculating the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction. The damage amounted to tens of thousands of dollars. I spent the next 3 days in a state of numb mechanical shock. I sifted through the completely destroyed remains of the barn, pulling out twisted pieces of blackened metal that used to be my livelihood. My hands were covered in dark soot, and my lungs ached from the lingering smoke, but I refused to cry. I still had one final safety net. I had maintained a highly comprehensive commercial agricultural insurance policy on all the main structures since the day I inherited the property. I had paid the heavy premiums on time every single month, even when it meant going hungry myself, just to ensure the farm was protected. I filed an emergency claim over the phone, confident that the insurance payout would at least allow me to replace the heavy tractor and rebuild a basic storage shed before the crucial spring planting season began. A week later, the county fire inspector arrived to conduct the official assessment required by my insurance agency. The inspector was a tall, heavily built man with a thick gray mustache and an incredibly arrogant, dismissive demeanor. He did not introduce himself or speak to me when he stepped out of his official county vehicle. He walked around the charred concrete foundation, kicking carelessly at the wet ashes with his heavy leather boots. He barely spent 20 minutes looking at the massive debris field. He did not take any soil samples to test for chemical accelerants, even though I repeatedly and clearly told him that the electrical power to the barn had been completely shut off at the main breaker panel all winter. I begged him to look at the fresh tire tracks leading up the back logging road, but he simply ignored me, waving his hand as if I were a nuisance. He scribbled a few lines on his official clipboard, got back into his warm truck, and drove away without offering a single word of empathy or professional insight. 2 agonizing weeks later, I walked down my long dirt driveway to the mailbox and opened a formal letter from the insurance company. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scanned the official text. The claim was entirely denied. The insurance company refused to compensate due to an electrical safety fault reported by a county inspector who was another friend of Richard. The words blurred before my eyes. My own father had leveraged his extensive wealthy country club network to ensure the official government report falsely blamed me for the catastrophic fire. He had orchestrated the violent destruction of my property in the dead of night, and then seamlessly used his powerful local friends to completely cut off my only legal avenue of financial recovery. The brutal reality of my situation crashed down on me with a crushing, suffocating weight. I had absolutely zero active income. I had no heavy equipment left to work the frozen earth. My emergency savings were completely wiped out from paying the insurance premiums that had just betrayed me. I was entirely alone in the freezing rural winter, facing absolute destitution. Penniless. I ate canned soup for a month. I drove to a discount grocery store 3 towns away so nobody would recognize me, and spent my last few crumpled dollar bills on flats of the cheapest high-sodium vegetable soup I could find. I strictly rationed my daily food intake to one small bowl of watery warm soup a day. The physical starvation was a constant, dull, agonizing ache in my stomach that made my hands shake uncontrollably and my vision blur with dark spots whenever I stood up too fast. My heavy winter clothes hung loosely off my rapidly emaciated frame. The cabin was agonizingly cold because I could not afford to buy delivered firewood, and I was too physically weak from starvation to chop the frozen timber in the surrounding forest. I wore 3 layers of clothing indoors at all times and slept under a heavy pile of old coats just to keep my core body temperature high enough to survive the freezing nights. The psychological warfare inflicted by my community was even worse than the severe physical starvation. Whenever I was absolutely forced to drive my rusted, sputtering truck into the local town to pay my electric bill using the literal loose change I had scrounged from my floorboards, I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares of the entire population pressing down on my shoulders. The hardware store owner, the bank tellers, the people I used to sit next to in the polished church pews, they all watched me with a toxic mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The whole town waited for me to file for bankruptcy. They whispered about me when I walked down the narrow aisles of the pharmacy. They all knew my summer crops had mysteriously failed. They knew the local bank manager had denied my seasonal operating loan. They knew my historic barn had burned to the ground in a spectacular blaze. They were simply counting the days until the stubborn, disgraced daughter finally broke down under the immense pressure and surrendered her grandfather's precious legacy to the bank. It was a cruel spectator sport for them. They desperately wanted to see the exact moment my spirit finally snapped so they could validate their loyalty to my wealthy parents. But they profoundly misunderstood the quiet, terrifying strength of a woman who has already lost everything except her fundamental dignity. I spent my long, freezing days wrapped in old blankets, sitting by the frosted window, reading my grandfather's old agricultural journals by the pale gray winter light. I conserved my physical energy. I mapped out impossible, desperate strategies to plant a minimal survival crop entirely by hand if I had to. I refused to let the freezing cold or the gnawing, relentless hunger defeat my analytical mind. I knew my family was sitting in their warm, perfectly decorated suburban house, eating massive hot dinners and waiting for the telephone to ring. They were waiting for me to call them crying. They were waiting for me to finally beg for their toxic, conditional mercy. The ultimate test of my emotional endurance arrived on a bitter Tuesday evening in late February. The wind was rattling the loose window panes of the dark cabin, and the temperature outside had dropped into the single digits. My cell phone suddenly lit up on the small wooden kitchen table. The caller identification displayed my mother's private cell phone number. The screen glowed with a harsh, bright light that hurt my tired, dark, adjusted eyes. For a long, silent moment, I just stared at the glowing rectangle. I had not heard her voice since the day she sent that cruel, final text message telling me I was no longer her daughter. My thumb hovered nervously over the screen. A weak, desperate, and entirely foolish part of me wondered if she was finally calling to check on my physical safety after hearing about the massive, devastating fire on the property. I took a deep, steadying breath, bracing myself for the impact, and answered the call. I did not say hello. I just held the cold plastic phone tightly against my ear, listening to the faint static of the connection. Barbara called for the first time in 3 years, only to taunt me. There was absolutely no warmth in her voice. There was no maternal concern for a child who was quite literally freezing and starving to death just a few miles away in the dark. Her voice was sharp-polished and perfectly controlled, dripping with a venomous, arrogant satisfaction that made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. "Have you seen the price of betraying your family yet?" she asked. The sheer calculated cruelty of that opening question echoed loudly in the small, dark cabin. She knew exactly what was happening to my body and my farm. She knew about the poisoned irrigation water. She knew about the denied bank loan. She knew her husband had deliberately arranged for my insurance claim to be fraudulently rejected after my barn was burned to the ground. This was not a tragic string of bad agricultural luck. This was a highly orchestrated financial siege designed and executed by the very people whose blood ran in my veins. I sat perfectly still in the freezing dark, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned bright white. My stomach was cramping painfully from the severe hunger, but my mind was suddenly crystal clear. I asked her in a flat, emotionless whisper exactly what she wanted from me. She did not hesitate to deliver the final crushing blow they had been meticulously preparing for 3 long years. "The bank will foreclose next week," she stated. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I knew I was dangerously behind on my property taxes for the current year because of the relentless sabotage draining my accounts, but I did not realize my father had actively pushed his deep banking connections to accelerate the legal foreclosure process so rapidly. They were moving in for the absolute kill. They had completely cornered me, closing off every single avenue of escape. My mother let that terrifying financial threat hang heavily in the cold air for a moment before offering her toxic, highly conditional lifeline. "Sign the papers to sell to Apex Holdings," she demanded. It was the exact same anonymous shell company my arrogant brother-in-law Bradley had aggressively pushed on me outside the bank a year ago, the fake corporate entity they had created to legally steal my land for pennies on the dollar and completely enrich themselves. Her aggressive demand was an absolute, undeniable admission of their guilt. She was openly admitting that this entire horrific ordeal, the starvation, the brutal isolation, the physical destruction of my property, was all a highly coordinated criminal effort to force my signature on a real estate contract. She smoothly told me that if I signed the legal papers that very night, they would miraculously stop the local bank from taking the property. She told me I could take the meager, insulting buyout money and finally run away to start a pathetic little life somewhere else, where I would not embarrass their pristine church reputation anymore. She waited on the line, listening to the silence, fully expecting me to sob, fully expecting me to finally break down and agree to their ruthless extortion. I closed my eyes. I felt the deep, familiar ache of the dark bruises on my arms from the hard, relentless labor. I felt the biting cold air pressing intensely against my thin skin. I remembered my grandfather Henry sitting quietly on the wooden porch, telling me that the land gives back exactly what you put into it. I had put my blood, my tears, my entire life savings, and my absolute soul into this dark dirt. I was not going to hand it over to a group of arrogant financial predators who happened to share my last name. I opened my eyes and stared hard into the dark, empty room. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of hearing my immense pain. I simply told her that she would have to bury me in the frozen dirt before I ever signed a single piece of paper for her or my father. I hung up, gritting my teeth, refusing to give up. I dropped the phone onto the worn wooden floorboards. The absolute silence of the cabin rushed back, enwrapping tightly around me like a heavy, protective blanket. The fire in the old cast-iron stove had burned down to a few faint, glowing red embers. I was entirely alone, facing the full, concentrated power of a wealthy, corrupt family and a town that had completely abandoned me to the wolves. I had absolutely no money left to my name. I was facing imminent legal foreclosure in a matter of days. The pure financial logic of the entire world dictated that I had definitively lost the war. But logic does not account for the sheer terrifying willpower of a woman who has been pushed far beyond the normal boundaries of human endurance. I pulled the heavy, scratchy wool blankets tightly around my thin, shivering shoulders and stared directly at the glowing embers in the stove. I was going to find a way to survive this coming week. I was going to audit every single legal document, every single county tax code, and every single obscure bank regulation I could get my hands on. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin and psychological torture. They were about to find out that they had deeply and fatally underestimated the wrong accountant. The freezing winter night stretched on endlessly, but a new fierce fire had just been ignited inside my chest, and it was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. The morning after my mother called to demand my surrender was the absolute coldest I had ever experienced in upstate New York. The heavy frost coated the inside of my small cabin windows, thick and white, completely blocking out the bleak view of the ruined, blackened barn. I was standing over a small camping stove, boiling a tin pan of melted snow to heat my single daily portion of discount vegetable soup. My hands were wrapped in 2 pairs of ragged wool gloves, but my fingers still ached with a deep, bone-chilling numbness that never seemed to go away. I had exactly 3 days until the local bank officially initiated the foreclosure proceedings. 3 days until my powerful family finally won their war of attrition. I was sitting at my worn kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of unpaid final notices, trying to figure out how to sell my grandfather's antique pocket watch just to buy enough diesel fuel to keep from freezing to death in my sleep. I had reached the absolute rock bottom of my physical and emotional endurance. I had nothing left to lose, and I had nothing left to give them. That is when I heard the heavy, slow crunch of large tires rolling up my long, unplowed gravel driveway. My head snapped up from my hands. Nobody ever drove out to the farm anymore, not since the massive fire destroyed my main barn. The county fire inspector had already come and gone. The local police had stopped patrolling my rural road months ago. My immediate panicked thought was that my father had finally sent someone to physically intimidate me into signing those corporate buyout papers for his anonymous real estate company. I stood up, pushing my wooden chair back against the uneven floorboards, and reached for the heavy iron fireplace poker resting near the cold cast iron stove. I walked to the frosted window, wiped a small circle of clear glass with my dirty sleeve, and peered outside into the blinding, harsh winter glare. It was not a local bank representative coming to serve eviction papers. It was not my arrogant brother-in-law Bradley arriving in his luxury sport utility vehicle to gloat. A massive, pristine black Lincoln sedan was idling smoothly near my snow-covered front porch. The engine was purring with a quiet, expensive hum that sounded completely alien and bizarre against the backdrop of my destroyed agricultural property. A man stepped out of the driver's side door. He was tall and distinguished, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal wool overcoat, a crisp white shirt, and highly polished leather shoes that immediately sank into the muddy slush of my frozen front yard. He did not look angry. He did not look threatening like the men my father usually associated with. He just looked entirely professional and deeply out of place in this frozen wasteland. He approached my heavy wooden door and knocked 3 firm, polite times. I gripped the heavy iron poker tightly behind my back, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open just a few cautious inches. The freezing winter wind whipped into the dark cabin, but the man simply offered a warm, highly professional smile. "Good morning, Ms. Clara," he said, his voice smooth and respectful. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I represent Omnicorp. I sincerely apologize for arriving unannounced like this, but my emails and certified legal letters have been returning undeliverable for several months. Omnicorp." The name echoed loudly in my tired mind. It was a massive global technology conglomerate. They built advanced software systems and digital infrastructure all over the world. They had absolutely nothing to do with struggling, bankrupt farmers in rural New York. I stood there shivering in my soot-stained canvas jacket, staring at this immaculate corporate representative. I told him in a raspy voice that he must have the wrong address. I told him there was absolutely nothing left on this ruined property to sell except burned wood and frozen, depleted dirt. He smiled gently, adjusting his leather gloves. "Actually, Ms. Clara, you have exactly what my executive board of directors has been desperately searching for. May I please come inside? It is freezing out here, and what I have to show you will take a few minutes to properly explain." I hesitated for a moment, but the sheer absurdity of the situation made me step aside and open the door. I invited him into my drafty, freezing cabin, apologizing quietly for the severe lack of heat. He did not judge the absolute poverty of my surroundings, or the smell of cheap canned soup. He simply unbuttoned his expensive overcoat, wiped the melting snow from his shoes, and took a seat at my worn kitchen table. Mr. Sterling opened a sleek black leather briefcase and carefully placed a thick stack of legal documents onto the scratched wood. He folded his clean hands and looked me directly in the eye with a level of serious professional respect my own family had never once afforded me. Ms. Clara Omnicorp is currently executing a massive expansion of our digital infrastructure across the eastern seaboard, he explained clearly and calmly. We require massive, highly specialized data centers to support our new federal cloud computing initiatives. These massive data centers generate an unbelievable amount of physical heat, and they require millions of gallons of naturally chilled water to keep the computer servers from suffering catastrophic meltdowns. I listened to him completely bewildered by the technical jargon. I told him I still did not understand what any of that had to do with my ruined farm or my current financial disaster. He pulled out a large, highly detailed topographical map and unrolled it across the kitchen table, tapping a specific red circle drawn right over my property lines. He explained that my ranch was located right at the intersection of a new aquifer and a new federal fiber optic cable. Your grandfather farm sits exactly on top of the largest untapped, naturally chilled underground aquifer in this entire region, he said. Furthermore, it intersects perfectly with a massive newly laid federal fiber optic network that runs directly beneath your lower 40 acres. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious, confidential pitch. It is the only geographical intersection of its kind on the entire East Coast. The corporation needs the land to build the largest water-cooled data center on the East Coast. We cannot build it anywhere else without spending hundreds of millions of dollars rerouting municipal water lines and federal cables. You hold the absolute perfect piece of geography, and we are fully prepared to compensate you extremely well for the immediate acquisition of the land. He slid a single piece of heavy bonded paper across the table toward me. It was a formal letter of intent to purchase. I looked down at the bold black numbers printed at the bottom of the page. My exhausted, starved brain simply could not process the massive string of zeros. I blinked hard, genuinely thinking the severe malnutrition and chronic stress were finally causing me to have visual hallucinations. I rubbed my eyes with my dirty wool gloves and looked down at the paper again. The numbers did not change. The offer price was $46 million. The breath completely left my lungs. My heart slammed against my ribs with a violent, terrifying force that made me dizzy. $46 million. That was not just enough money to pay off the minor back taxes. That was absolute generational wealth. That was empire-building money. That was the kind of money that made people incredibly powerful, legally untouchable, and entirely free from the burdens of normal society. My hands started shaking so violently that I had to press them flat against the rough wooden table just to keep the thick paper from vibrating out of my grip. I thought about the cheap canned soup I had been strictly rationing for a month. I thought about the freezing, miserable nights, shivering under old moth-eaten blankets. I thought about my father aggressively mocking me, calling my grandfather legacy a worthless pile of garbage while demanding I sell it to his fake company for a fraction of its true worth. I stared at Mr. Sterling, entirely speechless, trying to form a single coherent word, but my throat was completely dry. He mistook my shocked silence for the shrewd hesitation of a seasoned corporate negotiator. Please understand, Miss Clara. This is our absolute final and most aggressive financial offer, he said softly, his tone highly apologetic and slightly nervous. We really want to conclude this acquisition today, before the quarter ends. He inadvertently revealed the truth when he sighed and rubbed his forehead. We have been trying to buy this property for the past 4 years, through a local broker, but the paperwork has always been stalled due to your family disputes. The words hung heavily in the freezing air of the log cabin, ringing loudly in my ears like a deafening alarm bell. The warm blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. My heart stopped racing and suddenly began to beat with a slow, terrifying rhythm of pure clarity. Clara is stunned. I looked up slowly, meeting Mr. Sterling's confused eyes. I asked him in a perfectly flat whisper to repeat exactly what he had just said. He shifted slightly in his chair, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "I said we have been trying to acquire this land for 4 years," he repeated gently. "Your local representation kept telling our corporate office that the family estate was tied up in complicated legal disputes, and that the primary owner was mentally unfit to sign the legal transfer papers. They kept promising they would soon have full legal control of the deed and could finalize the massive sale to us directly." 4 years. The timeline exploded in my mind. That means before her grandfather passed away. My grandfather Henry had only been gone for 3 years. That meant my parents, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law Bradley knew about the massive Omnicorp data center project while my grandfather was still alive and breathing. They had known this entire time. The $46 million offer, the underground aquifer, the federal fiber optic cable. They had known all of it. They had lied to my grandfather on his deathbed, trying desperately to trick him into signing the property over to them before he passed. When he refused their manipulation and legally left the farm to me, they had launched a deliberate, highly coordinated campaign of psychological and financial terrorism to completely break me. The horrific realization washed over me in waves. My mother cutting me off, erasing me from the family group chat, and telling the entire church congregation I was mentally insane so no one would believe me. The deliberately severed fences allowing wild animals to destroy my very first crop. The industrial herbicide secretly dumped into my irrigation water. The mysteriously rejected bank loan orchestrated by my father golf partner. My beautiful, historic barn burning to the ground in the dead of winter, and the fraudulent insurance inspection. None of it was random bad agricultural luck. None of it was just petty toxic family jealousy. It was a highly calculated, ruthless, multi-million-dollar corporate theft orchestrated by the very people whose blood ran in my veins. They had intentionally starved me, frozen me, isolated me, and pushed me to the absolute brink of human endurance, just so I would sign the property deed over to their anonymous shell company for exactly $150,000. They wanted to steal my inheritance to turn around and immediately collect $46 million from Omnicorp. I sat in the freezing cabin, staring at the polished corporate representative who had just handed me the key to my absolute salvation and the undeniable concrete proof of my family ultimate betrayal. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw things. A strange, beautiful calm washed over my entire body, pushing out the cold and the fear. The confusion and the severe self-doubt that had plagued my mind for 3 brutal years completely evaporated into thin air. I was not a failure. I was not crazy. I was a highly trained former corporate auditor sitting on top of an absolute gold mine, surrounded by greedy, desperate predators who had deeply and fatally underestimated my survival instincts. I took a deep, steadying breath of the freezing air and looked down at the massive contract resting on my kitchen table. The cruel game they had been playing in the dark shadows for years was finally exposed to the blinding light of day. They thought they had driven me to the brink of absolute surrender. But all they had done was hand me the exact financial and legal ammunition I needed to completely destroy their empire. I looked back at Mr. Sterling, folding my hands neatly over the contract, and smiled for the very first time in 3 years. Mr. Sterling sat across from me at my worn kitchen table, his eyes filled with professional expectation, completely unaware of the absolute bomb he had just dropped in my frozen kitchen. The paper document between us vibrated slightly as the freezing winter wind rattled the loose window panes of the log cabin. $46 million. The numbers printed on the heavy, bonded paper were crisp black and entirely terrifying. But it was not the massive fortune that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the casual, offhand comment he had made just a second before. "We have been trying to buy this property for the past 4 years. Those words echoed in the silence of my mind like a deafening alarm bell. 4 years. I looked at the polished corporate representative, my heart slamming against my ribs with a violent, suffocating force. I had spent the last 3 years starving in this cabin, eating discount canned soup, shivering under old blankets, and watching my hard labor literally turn to ash because my family insisted this farm was a worthless pile of garbage. I had believed their insults. I had allowed their rejection to make me doubt my own sanity. I took a slow, deep, steadying breath, forcing my professional training as an internal auditor to completely take over my emotional responses. For 8 years, I had unraveled corporate lies and traced hidden assets. I knew how to mask my shock behind a blank clinical expression. I looked down at the contract, then up at Mr. Sterling. I need 48 hours to review these legal documents in detail. I told him, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of the absolute chaos raging inside my chest. I appreciate the aggressiveness of your offer, but I do not sign anything without a thorough, independent review of the terms, clauses, and property boundaries. Mr. Sterling blinked, clearly surprised by my sudden shift from a ragged, impoverished farmer to a cold, calculating professional. He looked around the drafty, unheated cabin, then nodded with an expression of sudden, sharp respect. He reached into his tailored charcoal overcoat, pulled out an embossed business card, and laid it neatly next to the contract. "Of course, Ms. Clara," he said smoothly. "We respect your diligence. Take the 48 hours, but please remember our executive board wants to close this transaction before the end of the quarter. My direct number is on the card. Call me the moment you are ready." He stood up, buttoned his expensive coat, and walked out into the driving snow. I stood by the window watching the heavy black Lincoln sedan roll slowly down my unplowed gravel driveway until its taillights disappeared into the white winter glare. The moment the sound of his engine faded into the distance, the quiet of the country rushed back in heavy and suffocating. I turned back to the kitchen table. I did not cry. I did not scream. The confusion and self-doubt that had plagued my mind for 3 brutal years completely evaporated, replaced by a cold Terrian diamond hard focus. My family had lied to me. They had lied to the entire community, and most importantly, they had lied to my grandfather Henry before he died. I pulled my old laptop out of my backpack and set it on the table. The cell service out here was notoriously terrible, especially in a winter storm, so I had to tether the computer to my phone. I placed the phone directly against the frosted window pane where the ice was thinnest, watching the signal bars fluctuate until they finally stabilized. For 8 years, my entire job had been finding what people desperately tried to hide. I knew that grease leaves fingerprints, and greed always leaves a paper trail. If my family had been playing a game in the dark for 4 years, they had definitely left footprints in the public record. I started with the New York State Department of State Division of Corporations database. My fingers moved across the keyboard with automated, rapid precision. I typed in the name of the anonymous shell company that had been persistently trying to buy my land for pennies on the dollar for the last 2 years, Apex Holdings, LLC. The initial screen returned exactly what I expected, a corporate dead end. The company was registered through a generic corporate agent in Delaware, a notorious legal shield designed to hide the true owners of private assets. But a shell company is only as good as the person who maintains its local filings. I bypassed the standard registry and pulled the original articles of organization from the county clerk public database. I pulled up the digitized image of the original paper filing from 2 years ago and zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the page. The entity had been organized by a boutique corporate law firm in Albany. I cross-referenced the state bar identification number listed in the hidden metadata of the PDF file. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The managing attorney who had personally filed the corporate papers, the man whose digital footprint was permanently stamped on the birth certificate of Apex Holdings LLC, was Bradley, my brother-in-law, my sister Chloe husband, the slick, expensive corporate lawyer who had stood in my parents' pristine living room and offered to rescue me from my debt by buying my farm for $150,000. A cold, heavy sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Apex Holdings was not an anonymous investment group. It was Bradley. It was my family. They had offered me exactly half of what I had spent to restore the farm, trying to trick me into surrendering the deed. But why? Why create a fake company to buy a property they had publicly called a worthless piece of trash? To find the answer, I dug deeper into the municipal archives. Because Mr. Sterling had mentioned a 4-year timeline, there had to be a public record of feasibility studies, utility easements, or infrastructure planning. Technology conglomerates do not build massive data centers without consulting local utility grids and water management boards first. I logged into the County Planning Commission archive portal. Small-town government databases are notoriously insecure and outdated. I navigated to the public correspondence logs from 4 years ago, specifically searching for any mentions of our local aquifer grid or the federal fiber optic cable corridor. Because the county clerk office often uploaded entire case files without redacting the original communications, many of the public hearing exhibits included complete email threads. I scrolled through hundreds of pages of mundane zoning requests until I found a folder labeled Proposed Federal Infrastructure Corridor 2022. I clicked the file, and a massive chain of archived emails filled my screen. I scrolled to the very bottom of the chain, looking for the origin date. The first email was dated 4 years ago, exactly 6 months before my grandfather Henry suffered his fatal stroke. It was from a corporate land scout representing Omnicorp, and it was addressed to a private, unlisted email account that I recognized instantly, my father's personal email address, Richard. The email was explicit. The scout detailed Omnicorp's intense interest in purchasing the 500-acre farm owned by Henry. The message explained that the property sat directly on top of a massive, naturally chilled underground aquifer and intersected perfectly with a newly planned federal fiber optic cable. The scout stated that the corporation was authorized to offer up to $46 million for the immediate acquisition of the deed. I sat frozen in my chair, the bright blue light of the laptop screen reflecting off the tears that finally broke free from my eyes and slid down my face. My father had known. He had known about the $46 million while Grandpa Henry was still alive and breathing. I scrolled up to read the next email in the chain. It was a forward from my father to Bradley. My father wrote, "Henry is being completely stubborn." I presented him with a standard commercial buyout offer, and he refused to even look at the numbers. He says the land belongs to the family and that money cannot buy his legacy. Bradley, we need a legal workaround. If Henry leaves the farm to Chloe or to us in his will, we can finalize the Omnicorp sale the day after the funeral. But if he leaves it to Clara, we are in trouble. She actually cares about that dirt, and she will never let us pave over it. Bradley's response arrived 2 days later. He wrote, "If the old man won't sell, we wait for the estate to transition. If he surprises us and leaves it to Clara, we will just have to make her sell it. I am setting up a shell entity called Apex Holdings, LLC. If she gets the land, we will cut her off entirely. We can use the company to buy her out for cheap when the financial pressure gets too high for a single woman to handle. She will have no choice but to surrender." The sheer breathtaking cruelty of the words printed on my screen made me physically sick. I gripped the edges of the wooden table, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. It was a blueprint. It was a highly calculated, coordinated financial execution manual written by my own father and brother-in-law. I kept scrolling my eyes, burning as I read through 3 years of archived municipal files, local zoning board meeting minutes, and text message transcripts submitted in unrelated county discovery filings. Every single piece of my suffering over the last 3 years began to connect like pieces of a horrific, malevolent puzzle. The first year when my perimeter fences were constantly being cut, allowing wild deer to trample thousands of dollars of my winter wheat harvest, I had thought it was just local teenagers playing pranks. Now, I looked at a public works log showing an anonymous complaint filed by Bradley office regarding unmaintained boundaries on my property used to justify local police inaction. The second year when my entire field turned a sickly shade of yellow because the irrigation reservoir had been secretly poisoned with commercial herbicide, I had fallen to my knees and wept thinking it was random bad luck. Now I saw an archived email from my father to a local agricultural distributor purchasing bulk industrial defoliant under his corporate business account, dated 48 hours before my crops died. The sequence of events was terrifyingly clear. When the poisoned crops ruined my income, I had gone to the local bank to apply for a standard operating loan. My immaculate credit history and massive land collateral had been suddenly rejected due to an unexplainable planning risk. I remembered the patronizing smile of the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy. Now I found a private calendar log from the country club showing my father Richard had played an 18-hole game of golf with Mr. Abernathy the morning before my loan review. They had deliberately choked off my financial air supply, and the moment I walked out of that bank, broken and desperate, Bradley had been waiting on the sidewalk in his luxury sport utility vehicle, holding a white envelope containing the $150,000 offer from Apex Holdings. They had manufactured the crisis, arranged my rejection, and then showed up pretending to be my financial saviors. And then came the final, most monstrous layer of the conspiracy. The third year. My barn catching fire in the dead of winter, destroying my tractor, my seeds, and my entire livelihood. The insurance company rejecting the claim because the county fire inspector reported an electrical safety fault. I looked at the digitized county inspector signature on the official report. I cross-referenced his name through my father public social media archives. He was a member of the same church council where my mother Barbara organized the charity bake sales. He was a family friend who had sat at my parents' Thanksgiving table while I was excluded. They had burned down my grandfather barn. They had destroyed my safety net. They had actively tried to freeze me out, starve me out, and ruin my life completely. Also, they could force my signature onto a real estate contract. They wanted to steal the 500 acres for a fraction of its value, leave me bankrupt and humiliated, and then turn around and hand the deed to Omnicorp to pocket the $46 million. My own mother had called me on the phone just days ago, taunting me about the price of betraying my family fully, knowing her husband and son-in-law had orchestrated the destruction of my property. I sat perfectly still in the freezing dark of the log cabin. The fire in the wood stove had completely died out, and my breath came in white, frosty clouds in the cold air. The absolute horror of what my family had done should have broken me. It should have driven me to my knees in despair, but as the clock on my laptop screen turned to 4 a.m, something inside me completely shifted. The pain, the grief, and the deep emotional ache of being unloved by my parents died a quiet, permanent death. In its place arose a cold, clinical, and entirely Terrian focus. I was an internal auditor. I spent my life dealing with numbers, structures, and evidence. I did not get angry. I did not scream into the void. I got documentation. I spent the remaining hours of the night systematically compiling every single piece of evidence I had uncovered. I downloaded the corporate registry files for Apex Holdings. I saved the email metadata connecting Bradley's signature to the shell company Inception. I screenshotted the 4-year-old correspondence between the Omnicorp Land Scout and my father. I archived the golf club logs, the commercial herbicide purchase receipts, and the falsified fire inspection reports. I organized everything into a flawless chronological forensic audit report. It was a bulletproof legal and financial indictment, structured with the exact same precision I used when exposing multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement schemes. I connected my laptop to my small battery-operated travel printer and printed 3 complete physical copies of the report. The mechanical feeding of the paper was the only sound in the quiet cabin as the sun began to peek over the snow-covered pine trees. I placed each copy into a crisp, clear plastic folder and bound them neatly. I looked at the 3 folders resting on my kitchen table next to Mr. Sterling, $46 million contract. My family thought they were playing a high-stakes game of financial ruin and psychological torture with a weak, isolated girl. They thought that by disowning me, ruining my reputation at the church, and burning down my livelihood, they had guaranteed my absolute surrender. They had no idea that they had spent 3 years pushing the wrong woman into a corner. They had forgotten that I knew exactly how to track their greed, how to expose their fraud, and how to completely dismantle their empire using nothing but the cold, hard reality of the law. I picked up Mr. Sterling business card, tapped my fingers against the smooth plastic of my phone, and looked out over the vast white fields of my grandfatherland. The shadows were finally retreating, and the light of day was flooding the farm. My family had spent 4 years trying to steal my legacy in the dark, but they were about to find out that the paper trail leads directly to the executioner block. The trap was set, and I was fully prepared to watch them walk right into it. The morning after I discovered the agonizing truth about my family, I did not wake up crying. In fact, I did not sleep at all. I sat at my worn kitchen table as the freezing winter sun slowly crawled over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the frosted floorboards of the log cabin. The stacks of printed public records, zoning permits, and hidden emails were spread out before me, like a map of a battlefield. For 3 years, I had believed I was fighting against bad luck, bad weather, and my own incompetence. Now I knew I had been fighting a highly coordinated psychological and financial war waged by the very people who were supposed to love me. The normal reaction to finding out your parents and your sister have spent years actively trying to destroy your life just to steal your inheritance would be explosive. A normal person would pick up the phone call their mother and scream until their vocal cords bled. A normal person would drive to their brother-in-law expensive law office and flip his mahogany desk. But I was no longer a normal person. The brutal isolation and the literal starvation they had forced upon me had burned away every ounce of my youthful impulsivity. I was a trained auditor, and an auditor knows that rage is a completely useless emotion when you are trying to trap a thief. Screaming only gives your enemy information. It tells them what you know, and it gives them time to prepare a defense. I realized that my absolute greatest advantage was their profound underestimation of me. They still thought I was the weak, overly emotional failure of a daughter who would eventually break under pressure. I decided right then and there to give them exactly the version of myself they expected to see. Instead of screaming or making a confrontational phone call, I maintained a cold and ruthless silence. I carefully gathered all the printed evidence and locked it inside a heavy metal lockbox I kept hidden under my floorboards. Then I picked up Mr. Sterling embossed business card. The clock was ticking. It was time to secure the absolute ultimate victory before my family even knew the game had changed. I tethered my laptop to my phone, stepping close to the freezing window to catch a sliver of cell service, and typed in the direct number for the Omnicorp corporate representative. Mr. Sterling answered on the second ring. His voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear a faint trace of anxiety beneath his polished tone. "Ms. Clara," he said, clearly surprised to hear from me so soon. "I hope you are having a good morning. Have you had a chance to review the initial purchase offer?" I did not exchange pleasantries. I dropped my voice into the flat, authoritative register I used to reserve for hostile corporate audits. "Mr. Sterling, I have reviewed your proposal," I told him. "I am fully aware of the underground aquifer. I am aware of the federal fiber optic intersection, and I am entirely aware that your company needs this specific acreage to build your new data center before the end of the fiscal quarter." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear him recalculating his negotiation strategy. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a new profound level of respect. "I see you have done your homework, Ms. Clara. If the $46 million figure is insufficient, my executive board is prepared to discuss a reasonable upward adjustment." That is the funny thing about corporate giants. They are so accustomed to greed that they do not know how to process anything else. "I do not want more money, Mr. Sterling," I replied calmly. $46 million is perfectly acceptable. However, I will only sign the final deed transfer if Omnicorp agrees to 2 highly specific, non-negotiable legal conditions. "Name them," he said, without hesitation. "First, I require an ironclad non-disclosure agreement governing this entire transaction," I explained. "The absolute strictest confidentiality clause your lawyers can draft. Nobody in my local county government, no local real estate brokers, and absolutely no members of my family can know that this property has been sold or that Omnicorp is the buyer. This information must remain completely sealed for exactly 14 days. 14 days was the exact amount of time I needed to herd my arrogant family into the perfect public trap. That is highly unusual, but entirely doable, Mr. Sterling confirmed. We prefer discretion in our land acquisitions anyway. What is the second condition? The purchase funds cannot be wired to my personal bank account, I told him. I am establishing a private trust today. The entity will be named the Henry Legacy Trust in honor of my grandfather. The entire $46 million must be wired directly into that trust account the moment the ink dries on our contract. I knew exactly how wealth worked. If a massive sum of money suddenly appeared in my local community bank account, my father, powerful friends on the bank board would flag the transaction immediately. They would see the money alert my father, and my family would instantly realize their shell company scheme had failed. A private trust managed by an independent wealth attorney in a completely different city would act as an impenetrable financial fortress. The money would be legally mine, but it would be entirely invisible to the toxic people trying to ruin me. Mr. Sterling agreed to everything. He promised to have his legal team draft the revised contracts and the confidentiality agreements by the end of the day. We arranged a secure digital signing process to avoid any suspicious local notary appointments. When I ended the call, I looked around my drafty, freezing log cabin. I was still wearing a soot-stained canvas jacket. I was still planning to eat a cheap can of discount soup for dinner. But in a matter of hours, I was going to be a multimillionaire. The sheer gravity of that transition made my hands tremble, but I forced myself to stay focused. The financial victory was secured. Now came the psychological warfare. I had to play the prey to catch the predators. To keep my family engaged, I texted Chloe and Bradley, feigning desperation. I sat at my wooden kitchen table holding my cracked cell phone and opened the group message thread I had not participated in for months. I needed to craft a message so utterly pathetic, so completely broken, that their massive egos would swallow it without a single second of suspicion. I thought about the sheer physical misery of the past 3 years. The cold, the hunger, the exhaustion. I channeled all of that real trauma into a perfectly fabricated surrender. I typed the words slowly, deliberately, ignoring the fact that my hands were shaking. Bradley, Chloe. I am so sorry to bother you. You were right. You were right about everything. I cannot do this anymore. The bank called me this morning and they are initiating the final foreclosure process next week. I am completely out of money. I do not even have enough cash to buy firewood to get through the weekend. Please tell me that the investment company you mentioned is still interested. I paused, staring at the glowing screen. I needed to make the bait completely irresistible. I needed them to believe they had absolutely crushed my spirit into dust. She said she was about to lose the farm to the bank and was willing to sign over to Apex Holdings for $150,000 to get out of debt. I hit send. The moment the text message left my phone, a wave of profound nausea washed over me. It is a terrifying thing to willingly hand your abusers exactly what they want, even when you know it is a trap. I set the phone face down on the table and waited. I knew exactly what was happening in their pristine suburban house at that very moment. I could picture Bradley sitting in his home office looking at his expensive smartphone. I could picture him showing the message to my sister with a smug, victorious grin. I could imagine them calling my parents, immediately celebrating the fact that the stubborn, ungrateful daughter had finally been starved into submission. My phone buzzed loudly against the wood. It had been less than 4 minutes. They were so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need to win that they did not even bother to make me wait. I turned the phone over. The message was from Bradley. Clara, it is incredibly big of you to finally admit you need help. Your sister and I have been sick with worry about you out there in the cold. It is a terrible shame about the bank foreclosure, but this is exactly why family steps in to save you from your own mistakes. I just made a quick phone call to my contacts at Apex Holdings. They are hesitant because the property is in such horrific condition after the barn fire, but as a personal favor to me, they have agreed to honor their original offer. $150,000 cash. We can draft the property transfer documents this afternoon. I read the message and a cold, dark laugh escaped my throat. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his response was breathtaking. He had orchestrated the destruction of my crops. He had helped coordinate the arson that burned down my grandfather's beautiful barn. And now he was using the very damage he caused as a fake negotiation tactic to make it seem like he was doing me a massive favor by buying the land for pennies. A second message popped up this time from my sister Chloe. Clara, we are just so relieved you are finally being reasonable. Mom and Dad are going to be so happy you are coming back to reality. Do not worry about the debt anymore. Bradley is going to handle all the confusing legal paperwork for you. You just need to sign where he tells you to, and you can put this whole ugly nightmare behind you. I stared at the two messages side by side. They thought they had me perfectly boxed in. They thought they were brilliant corporate strategists, maneuvering a foolish, emotional woman out of her inheritance. They had no idea that while they were busy plotting to steal a property they thought was worth a few $100,000, I was sitting in my cabin digitally signing a corporate acquisition contract worth $46 million. I wiped a layer of frost off the inside of my cabin window and looked out at the sprawling snow-covered fields. The trap was set. The bait had been swallowed whole. I texted Bradley back, keeping my replies short and submissive. I told him I was incredibly grateful for his intervention. I asked him to prepare the Apex Holdings transfer documents. But I set one final crucial condition of my own. I told him I was too ashamed of my failure to simply sign the papers in a quiet lawyer office. I told him I wanted to sign the property over to him in front of my parents and the prominent members of our community, so I could officially apologize to everyone for being so stubborn and mentally unstable. Bradley agreed instantly. His ego simply could not resist the promise of a public surrender. He loved the idea of parading his defeated sister-in-law in front of the town, showing everyone what a generous, wealthy savior he was. We set the date for exactly 1 week later. It would give him enough time to draw up the fraudulent Apex Holdings paperwork, and it fell perfectly within my 14-day confidentiality window with Omnicorp. I spent the next 7 days living a double life. To my family, I was a ghost calling occasionally to confirm details with a voice that sounded weak and completely broken. But in the shadows, I was moving with the speed and precision of a corporate assassin. I worked closely with my newly hired independent wealth manager in Manhattan to finalize the Henry Legacy Trust. I reviewed the wire transfer protocols, confirming that Omnicorp massive payment was securely locked away in a private portfolio that my family could never touch and never trace. I also spent hours organizing my forensic audit of their crimes. I took the printed emails, the falsified county fire inspection reports, the metadata connecting Bradley to the Apex Holdings shell company, and the country club logs proving my father had manipulated the bank manager. I placed each piece of undeniable evidence into a thick professional binder. I made multiple copies, ensuring that when the truth finally dropped, there would be absolutely no room for them to deny their actions or spin a new narrative. On the final night before our scheduled meeting, I sat by my wood stove drinking a cup of hot tea. The cabin was still freezing and I was still hungry, but the physical discomfort no longer mattered. I looked at the glossy black binder resting on my table, right next to my cracked cell phone. My mother had told the entire church congregation I was insane. My father had told me I was a worthless piece of garbage. My sister had demanded I fund her luxury lifestyle with my inheritance, and my brother-in-law had actively tried to destroy my life to line his own pockets. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to stand in front of their wealthy friends and watch the rebellious daughter sign away her dignity and her future. I took a deep breath of the cold winter air, feeling a profound, dangerous sense of calm settle deep into my bones. Tomorrow night, I was going to give them the biggest spectacle this town had ever seen. The predators had spent years hunting me in the dark, but tomorrow they were going to find out that the prey had just locked the cage. My brother-in-law Bradley was a man who prided himself on being the absolute smartest person in any room he walked into. He was a highly paid corporate lawyer who spent his days negotiating multi-million-dollar mergers and intimidating smaller firms into submission. But greed has a very funny way of making arrogant men completely blind to their own vulnerabilities. Less than 2 hours after I sent that pathetic fabricated text message, pretending I was broken and desperate, he sent a formal real estate contract directly to my email inbox. He did not bother to call and check on my mental health. He did not ask if I had enough food to survive the freezing weekend. He just sent a highly restrictive legal document that would completely strip me of my grandfather Henry and his massive farm for a tiny fraction of what it was truly worth. I sat at my worn wooden kitchen table in the freezing log cabin and opened the attachment on my old laptop. The contract was officially drafted under the name Apex Holdings LLC. Reading through the dense, complicated legal jargon, I felt a deep, cold disgust settling into my stomach. Bradley had structured the agreement with ruthless precision. He had inserted clauses ensuring that I would surrender all mineral rights, all water rights, and all future commercial claims to the property in perpetuity. He knew exactly what he was stealing. He knew about the underground aquifer and the federal fiber optic cable. At the very bottom of his email, he had written a short, highly patronizing note. He told me to use the electronic signature software attached so we could expedite the transfer immediately and save me from the impending bank foreclosure that his own father-in-law had orchestrated. I could have signed it digitally right then and there and ruined his life with a single click later during the discovery phase of a lawsuit. But that was not the plan. I did not just want to stop their theft in private. I wanted to expose it to the blinding light of day. I wanted the entire town that had boycotted me and called me crazy to see exactly who they had been worshiping every Sunday. I picked up my cracked cell phone and typed my reply carefully, keeping my tone submissive and defeated. I told Bradley that the recent winter storm had severely damaged the satellite internet receiver at the farm. I claimed the connection was far too unstable to load his secure electronic signature software properly. I told him I needed to sign a physical paper copy with real ink to make it official and legal. It was a simple, transparent lie, but it played perfectly into his arrogant assumptions about my failing primitive lifestyle in the dirt. He replied within 10 minutes, agreeing to a physical signing. Now I just needed to set the perfect stage for their absolute public destruction. Every single spring, the town council held a massive fundraising dinner at the largest, most exclusive country club in the county. It was the premier social event of the year. The mayor, the bank managers, the church elders, and every prominent business owner attended to drink expensive wineware, designer clothes, and congratulate themselves on being upstanding moral citizens. This year, the event held a very special significance for my toxic family. My father, Richard, was scheduled to be honored as the Citizen of the Year for his decades of alleged charitable service to the community. My mother, Barbara, had been bragging about this award for months before she formally disowned me. It was the absolute perfect venue for an execution. It was the exact place where my parents felt the most powerful, the most respected, and the most untouchable. I texted Bradley again. I told him my rusted farm truck was running out of gas, and I could not afford to drive all the way to his fancy law office in the city. I suggested we meet briefly on Saturday night, right at the country club during the spring fundraising dinner. I knew he would be attending in his best suit to watch my father receive his golden plaque. I told him we could just step into a quiet side room like the club library for 5 minutes. I promised I would sign the deed over to his fake company, take my pathetic little check, and disappear back into the freezing night, so I would not embarrass my pristine family in front of their wealthy friends. Bradley took the bait without a single moment of hesitation. He absolutely loved the idea. He loved the sheer cruel poetry of it. In his dark mind, while my father was standing on a brightly lit stage, accepting an award for being a pillar of the community, he and my sister Chloe would be in a back room, quietly finalizing the ultimate theft of my inheritance. They thought they were orchestrating a masterpiece of high society deception. They agreed to meet me in the country club library at 8 o'clock sharp, right before my father took the stage for his acceptance speech. While my family was busy picking out their expensive outfits and practicing their fake smiles for the country club dinner, I was moving massive financial mountains in absolute silence. Mr. Sterling from Omnicorp did not waste a single second. True to his word, his corporate legal team drafted the revised purchase agreement the very next morning. The contract explicitly included the strict 14-day confidentiality clause I had demanded. I spent 2 full days reviewing every single page with an independent real estate attorney I had hired over the phone from a high-powered firm in Manhattan. I paid his exorbitant retainer fee using a high-interest credit card because I knew the return on investment would be absolutely staggering within the week. We set up the private financial trust just as I had planned. We named it the Henry Legacy Trust, honoring the grandfather who had believed in me when no one else in my bloodline did. The trust was structured as an impenetrable, secure fortress, completely shielding my identity and my incoming assets from any local county snooping or banking leaks. Once the legal framework was perfectly solidified, I signed the official transfer documents for Omnicorp. I did it sitting at my kitchen table, wrapped in a heavy, scratchy wool blanket, shivering in the freezing cold, while signing away a property that had brought me nothing but physical agony and emotional devastation. Then the agonizing waiting began. Mr. Sterling told me the corporate wire transfer would take 48 hours to clear through the federal banking system and land in my private trust. Those were the longest 2 days of my entire life. I still had no central heat. I was still eating cheap, high-sodium canned soup out of a plastic bowl. I was still living like a ghost in the dark shadows of a burned-down barn, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. On Friday morning, just 1 day before the country club dinner, I woke up to the sound of a sharp alert on my phone. It was an automated, secure message from the private wealth management firm in New York. I logged into the secure banking portal using my frozen, stiff fingers. The screen loaded incredibly slowly over my weak cellular connection, teasing me with every passing second. And then, the final numbers appeared on the glowing screen. $46 million. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I counted the commas and the zeros over and over again. The money had officially cleared. The transaction was complete and legally binding. The farm no longer belonged to me. It belonged to a global technology conglomerate, and I was officially a multimillionaire. I set the phone down on the wooden table and pressed my dirty, calloused hands over my face. I did not cheer. I did not laugh or dance around the small, empty cabin. A deep, profound wave of pure relief washed over my entire body, melting away 3 years of constant, terrifying survival mode. The cruel financial abuse was over. The physical starvation was over. The crippling daily fear of losing everything to a corrupt bank was completely gone. I was finally truly safe. Saturday morning arrived with a clear, pale blue sky and a biting, harsh winter chill. I woke up knowing it was the very last day I would ever spend in that drafty, miserable log cabin. I did not pack my bags. I did not want to take a single piece of furniture or clothing from this place that carried the heavy, suffocating weight of my suffering. I only packed my laptop, the original signed Omnicorp contract, and the thick, glossy black binder containing the forensic audit of my family and their extensive crimes. I drove into a neighboring wealthy town far away from the judgmental eyes of my local church community and walked straight into a high-end designer boutique. For the past 3 years, I had worn nothing but stained canvas jackets, heavy, muddy work boots, and ragged, oversized sweaters. I looked exactly like a woman who had been beaten down by the harsh world. But tonight, I needed to look like an executioner. I bought Faye a beautifully tailored emerald green suit that fit my frame perfectly. I bought expensive polished leather heels. I went to an upscale salon and had my hair professionally washed, cut, and styled, removing the stubborn smell of wood smoke and freezing wind. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized myself. The tired, starved, frightened girl was gone forever. A cold, wealthy, highly dangerous, confident woman stared back at me. I drove back to the empty farm just as the sun began to set, casting long, dark, purple shadows across the snowy fields. I looked at the ruined property one last time. My grandfather Henry had loved this land deeply, but he had loved me more. He would never have wanted me to suffer this much physical and emotional abuse just to keep a piece of frozen dirt. He gave me the farm so I could be free, and I had finally achieved that beautiful freedom. I locked the cabin door, threw the brass key deep into the snowbank, and climbed into my truck. The drive to the country club took exactly 30 minutes. My heart beat with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. I was not nervous. I was not afraid of my father and his explosive temper. I was not afraid of my mother and her cruel, manipulative words. I was not afraid of my sister and her arrogant, mocking laughter. They had absolutely no power over me anymore. I parked my rusted, sputtering farm truck at the very front of the country club parking lot, surrounded by a vast sea of gleaming luxury sedans and expensive sports cars. The grand brick building was brightly lit with soft, warm golden lights radiating from the massive arched windows. I could hear the faint, elegant sound of a string quartet playing inside the main ballroom. I grabbed the heavy black binder from the passenger seat. Inside those glossy pages was the undeniable paper trail, proving Bradley had created the fake shell company. The proof of my father manipulating the local bank manager into denying my loan. The proof of the fraudulent county fire inspection that ruined my insurance claim. And the absolute proof that they had known about the $46 million aquifer deal long before my grandfather died in his hospital bed. They thought they had backed a desperate, starving animal into a dark, hopeless corner. They were about to learn that they had simply handed a loaded weapon to a highly trained auditor who knew exactly how to destroy a corrupt ledger. I walked across the frozen paved parking lot toward the heavy, polished brass doors of the country club. The winter air was freezing, but I did not feel the cold at all. I felt a burning, righteous heat spreading through my chest and warming my blood. Tonight, my father was going to stand on a stage and accept an award for being the best, most charitable citizen in the county. And tonight, I was going to tear his entire fraudulent empire down to the very foundations while the whole town watched. The annual spring fundraising dinner was the absolute crown jewel of our local high society. It was held in the grand assembly room of the historic town hall, and tonight, the massive space was completely transformed. Gigantic crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of perfectly arranged round tables draped in heavy white silk. The air was thick with the smell of expensive, catered roast beef and the heavy floral perfume worn by women who spent their afternoons playing tennis and judging their neighbors. This was the exact crowd that had turned their backs on me at church 3 years ago. These were the people who had crossed the street to avoid me when I walked out of the local hardware store with dirty hands and bruised arms. Tonight, they were all wearing their finest evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, displaying their wealth and their hypocritical smiles with absolute pride. I stepped through the heavy oak double doors of the town hall, just as the mayor was tapping his microphone to call the room to order. I did not sneak in through the back. I did not lower my head. I walked right down the center aisle. For 3 years, this town had only seen me covered in freezing mud and dark soot. Tonight, I was wearing a flawless emerald green designer suit, purchased with the very first proceeds from my private trust fund. It fit me like absolute armor. My hair was professionally styled, and my posture was as straight as a steel rod. I was no longer the exhausted, starving farmer girl they had all mocked. The transformation was so complete that for a few seconds, nobody recognized me. Then the whispering started. It rippled through the crowded room like a sudden gust of wind across a dry wheat field. Heads turned rapidly. Wine glasses paused halfway to open mouths. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the front of the room. At the very center of the brightly lit stage stood my father, Richard. He was wearing a custom black tuxedo, looking incredibly smug and self-important. The mayor was just about to hand him a heavy glass plaque engraved with the title Citizen of the Year. Sitting directly below him at the most prominent VIP table were my mother, Barbara, and my sister, Chloe. They were surrounded by local politicians and wealthy real estate developers. Barbara was beaming with intense pride, wearing a diamond necklace that probably cost more than my first tractor. Chloe sat beside her, sipping champagne and laughing at a joke someone had just made. They were celebrating their absolute victory. In their arrogant minds, they had successfully starved me into total submission. They believed I was only here tonight to quietly surrender my grandfather legacy so they could collect their $46 million payout from the technology conglomerate. When my mother finally spotted me walking toward the front, her perfect smile vanished instantly. She grabbed Chloe by the arm and pointed. My sister dropped her champagne glass onto the white silk tablecloth, spilling the expensive drink everywhere. Up on the stage, my father lost his train of thought completely. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. I was not supposed to look like this. I was supposed to crawl into the room, looking broken, defeated, and desperate for their charity. The emerald suit and my confident stride completely shattered their carefully constructed narrative of the crazy, destitute daughter. I reached the edge of the VIP section and stopped. I did not say a single word. I just stood there holding my glossy black leather briefcase, looking directly at my father on the stage. The silence in the massive hall was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. My brother-in-law Bradley reacted first. He stepped out from the shadows near the stage-side stairs, walking quickly toward me with a tight, forced smile on his face. He grabbed my elbow, trying to guide me away from the hundreds of staring eyes. "Clara, you look wonderful," he whispered sharply, his fingers digging painfully into my arm. "We have a private room reserved for our business, just down the hall. Let us go settle the paperwork so you do not disrupt your father and his big moment." I pulled my arm out of his grip with a swift, aggressive jerk. "I will walk myself," I told him coldly. "Lead the way." Bradley nodded tensely and gestured toward a set of double doors near the back of the stage. My mother and sister quickly stood up, abandoning their VIP table to follow us. My father hastily accepted his glass plaque from the confused mayor, muttered a brief, disjointed thank you into the microphone, and hurried off the stage to join the procession. They practically herded me down a narrow carpeted corridor and pushed me into a small private meeting room used by the town council. The room smelled of stale coffee and lemon polish. A long mahogany conference table sat in the center. Bradley had already arranged the space for an execution. There were 3 local town council members waiting inside the room. They were older, wealthy men who frequently played golf with my father and voted on his local zoning permits. My family had brought them here to act as official witnesses. They wanted respected members of the community to watch me willingly sign away my property so no one could ever accuse them of stealing it. My father slammed the meeting room door shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the charity dinner outside. He turned to face me, his face flushed an angry shade of red. "What on earth are you wearing?" "Clara," he demanded, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You look ridiculous. Did you put those clothes on a credit card you cannot afford? You're about to lose everything you own, and you show up here dressed like a runway model." I ignored him completely. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down at the head of the conference table, placing my black briefcase flat on the polished wood. "I am ready to conduct our business," I said calmly. "Let us see the documents." Bradley stepped forward, eager to take control of the situation. He opened his designer leather bag and pulled out a crisp stack of legal papers. He placed them carefully in front of me. He then pulled out a certified bank check and laid it right on top of the contract. The bold black numbers on the check read exactly $150,000. "There it is," Clara Bradley said, using his most patronizing corporate voice. "Just like we promised, Apex Holdings is prepared to transfer this cash to you immediately. It is a completely clean break. You sign on the dotted line tonight, and the bank foreclosure stops tomorrow morning. You walk away free and clear from that rotting pile of dirt." My mother stepped up behind my chair, placing her hands on my shoulders in a fake display of maternal affection. The town council members were watching closely, so she put on a flawless performance. "We know this has been a terrible struggle for you, sweetheart," she cooed softly. "We know you are exhausted and broke, but family takes care of family. We convinced the buyers to give you this money so you can start over somewhere else. Sign it, Clara. We are still a family. We are saving you." Chloe leaned against the mahogany table, crossing her arms over her expensive silk dress. "Just sign it so we can go back to the party," she complained loudly. "Dad is the citizen of the year, and you are ruining his celebration with your stubborn pride. Take the money and leave." I looked down at the contract printed with the name Apex Holdings, LLC. I looked at the miserable, insulting check for $150,000. Then I looked up at the 3 town council members sitting across the table. They were nodding approvingly, completely convinced by my family and their benevolent savior routine. I did not sign the paper. I pushed the Apex Holdings contract back across the table. I am not signing anything, I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any fear or hesitation. My father slammed his hand against the mahogany table, making the council members jump in their seats. "Stop playing games, Clara," he roared. "You have absolutely zero leverage here. The bank takes the farm on Monday. You have no money. You have no credit. You sign that paper right now, or you will be sleeping on the streets by next week." I calmly popped the brass latches on my black briefcase. "I do not need leverage, Dad," I replied, looking him dead in the eye, "because I no longer own the farm." The entire room froze. Bradley dropped his smug smile. My mother pulled her hands off my shoulders as if she had just been burned. "What are you talking about?" My father whispered, his face suddenly turning a sickly shade of gray. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. I threw the first paper down hard against the mahogany table. It was the official wire transfer receipt. "I sold the entire 500 acres to Omnicorp yesterday afternoon," I announced, my voice echoing sharply off the walls of the small room. "The deed transfer has already been recorded and sealed by a federal judge. $46 million was wired directly into my private trust account. I am entirely debt-free. I own my grandfather's legacy in pure cash, and you get absolutely nothing." Bradley lunged forward, grabbing the receipt to read the top page. His eyes scanned the document rapidly, and his face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. "Omnicorp." He gasped, his voice cracking. "No, that is impossible. How did you know?" "I knew because you left a massive digital paper trail," Bradley, I said, leaning forward. I pulled out the massive glossy binder containing my forensic audit and threw it onto the table right in front of the 3 town council members. My sister Chloe let out a loud, piercing shriek. $46 million, she screamed, staring at her husband. "Bradley, you said we were going to get that money. You promised me." My father stumbled backward, hitting the wall. He gripped his chest, breathing heavily. "You sold it," he wheezed. "You sold our land. That was my father's property. That was our family fortune. You stole it from us." I stood up from my chair. My blood was running hot, but my mind was incredibly clear. I did not steal anything, I told him, my voice rising in volume and power. I protected my inheritance from a group of pathetic, greedy criminals. I turned to the 3 town council members, who were sitting in absolute stunned silence. "Gentlemen," I said, pointing to the detailed audit report, "I highly suggest you read the rest of that binder before you take any more photos with your Citizen of the Year." I pulled out the final stack of evidence and spread it across the mahogany table like a deck of cards. Here's the corporate registry proving that Bradley personally created Apex Holdings as an anonymous shell company to buy my land for pennies. Here are the country club logs proving my father conspired with the local bank manager to freeze my operating loans. Here are the receipts for the commercial herbicide my father bought right before my irrigation reservoir was mysteriously poisoned. And here are the leaked emails proving Richard and Barbara knew about the Omnicorp data center project 4 years ago while my grandfather was still alive. The council members stared at the documents, their eyes wide with horror. They realized instantly that they had been dragged into a room to witness a massive criminal fraud. One of the older men pushed his chair back, standing up quickly to distance himself from my father. "Richard, what is this?" he demanded angrily. "You tried to use us to cover up a multi-million-dollar theft against your own daughter." My mother started to cry, loud, panicked sobs. "Clara, please," she begged, reaching out toward me. "We were just trying to help the family. We were going to share the money with you eventually. You have to believe me." I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. "Do not ever call me your family again," I warned her. "You told this entire town I was crazy. You watched me starve for 3 years. You let your husband burn down my barn in the middle of a freezing winter just to break my spirit. You threw me away for cash." I looked at the 4 of them standing there, completely exposed and utterly ruined. My father was clutching his chest, unable to speak. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably. Chloe was violently shaking her husband, demanding to know why his brilliant legal plan had failed. Bradley was staring blankly at the floor, realizing his entire legal career was completely over. The absolute terror, in their eyes, was the greatest justice I could have ever asked for. I did not need to scream or break things. I had simply audited their lies and presented the truth. I picked up my empty briefcase, turned my back on them, and walked toward the door, ready to step back into the bright lights of the massive assembly hall. The heavy silence in the small mahogany meeting room was absolutely deafening. I stood at the head of the conference table watching my father. Richard's face turned a sickly, translucent shade of pale as he stared at the printed wire transfer receipt. All the arrogant bluster, all the self-righteous authority he had wielded like a weapon, my entire life completely evaporated in a single instant. Beside him, my brother-in-law Bradley stammered incoherently. His mouth opened and closed, but no actual words came out. He looked like a fish, gasping for air on a dry dock. The brilliant corporate lawyer who had spent years manipulating property laws and creating fake shell companies to steal my inheritance could not form a single coherent sentence. I did not want to keep this revelation confined to a tiny hidden room. I wanted the entire community to hear exactly who they had been worshiping. I turned my back on my trembling family and walked purposefully toward the heavy wooden double doors that separated us from the grand assembly hall. I grabbed the polished brass handles and pulled the doors wide open. The bright golden light from the crystal chandeliers spilled into the dim meeting room, and the soft classical music from the charity dinner instantly drifted toward us. I stepped right into the threshold, letting my voice echo clearly and powerfully through the massive hall. I wanted every single person sitting at those expensive silk-draped tables to hear the absolute truth. I looked at the hundreds of wealthy guests, the church elders, the local politicians, and I spoke with a clarity that cut through the room like a sharp blade. For 3 years, my parents, Richard and Barbara, told this entire town that I was mentally unstable. They told you I was a thief and a failure. They allowed me to be completely ostracized by the very community I grew up in. But they lied to every single one of you. I pointed directly at my father, who was now desperately trying to hide behind the doorframe. They orchestrated a relentless campaign of psychological and physical destruction against me. They hired people to cut my farm fences so wild animals would destroy my crops. They purchased commercial herbicide to secretly poison my irrigation water supply. They conspired with the local bank manager to deny my agricultural loans. And when none of that broke my spirit, they arranged for my historic barn to be burned to the ground in the middle of a freezing winter, utilizing a corrupt county inspector to falsely deny my insurance claim. Gasps rippled through the packed town hall. Women covered their mouths in absolute horror. Men set down their wine glasses, staring at my father in profound disgust. But I was not finished. I raised the glossy black binder high in the air for everyone to see. They did all of this to starve me into submission because they wanted to steal my grandfather's legacy. They knew about a massive federal infrastructure project intersecting my property. They deliberately deceived my grandfather on his deathbed, and when he left the land to me, they created a fake corporate shell company called Apex Holdings to buy my farm for pennies on the dollar. They wanted to steal $46 million. My mother, Barbara, finally stumbled out of the meeting room, her face stained with black mascara, her hands shaking violently. "Clara, please stop," she wailed hysterically, putting on her best victim performance for the crowd. "You are confused, sweetheart. We love you. We were just trying to protect the family estate. That is absolutely enough." A new, highly authoritative voice rang out from the back of the assembly hall. The crowd parted instantly as a tall, distinguished man in a flawless charcoal overcoat stepped forward into the golden light. It was Mr. Sterling, the executive representative from Omnicorp. He had attended the spring fundraising dinner tonight as one of the new corporate sponsors for the town council. He walked straight toward the VIP stage, his expression radiating cold corporate fury. "I can personally confirm every single word this young woman just said," Mr. Sterling announced to the stunned audience. "I represent Omnicorp, the technology conglomerate that requires the specific aquifer and federal fiber optic intersection located entirely on Clara property. For 4 years, Richard and Bradley have actively deceived our corporate acquisitions team. They falsely claimed Clara was legally incompetent and promised they would soon have the deed to sell to us. But Clara is not incompetent. She is brilliant, and I am proud to announce that Clara is the legitimate owner who had just completed the transaction directly with us. The $46 million is safely in her private trust, and Omnicorp now owns the land. The absolute finality of Mr. Sterling's statement completely shattered any remaining illusions. The town council members sitting in the front row stood up immediately, distancing themselves from my parents as if my family had a contagious disease. Before my father could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, another man stepped out from the crowd, joining Mr. Sterling. He wore a sharp navy suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He introduced himself to the silent room as the senior litigation counsel for Omnicorp. We take corporate fraud and malicious interference very seriously, the lawyer stated, his voice echoing like a final judicial gavel. Omnicorp Legal Department has already compiled the evidence provided by Clara. We are officially announcing that tomorrow morning we will file a formal complaint with federal authorities to investigate Bradley and Richard for severe planning fraud, real estate fraud, and criminal extortion. You attempted to use a multi-billion-dollar federal infrastructure project to execute a malicious family theft. The federal government does not take kindly to local corruption manipulating interstate commerce deals. You will both be hearing from federal prosecutors very shortly. The punishment was absolute and instantaneous. I watched my father career at the church and in this town crumble overnight right before my very eyes. The mayor, who had just handed Richard the Citizen of the Year award, marched right up to the stage, grabbed the heavy glass plaque off the podium, and walked away without looking back. The church elders, who had happily eaten my mother, baked goods while shunning me, turned their backs in unified absolute disgust. My parents were completely ruined. Their social standing, their wealth, their arrogant pride, all completely incinerated in a matter of minutes. My sister Chloe suddenly pushed past my father and ran toward me. Her expensive designer silk dress caught on the doorframe, tearing near the hem, but she did not even notice. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my emerald suit jacket. She was weeping loudly, her face contorted in absolute panic. "Clara, please," she begged, her voice cracking with terror. "You have to tell them I had nothing to do with this. I did not know about the poisoned crops or the barn fire. I swear to God I knew nothing about the sabotage. Bradley kept me in the dark. You cannot let them take my husband to federal prison. We will lose our house. I will lose everything. Please, Clara. I am your sister. Have mercy on me." I looked down at the woman who had demanded I hand over my entire inheritance just so she could buy luxury handbags and start a vanity real estate firm. I looked at the sister who had mocked my dirty clothes, laughed at my isolation, and eagerly waited for me to be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. I gently but firmly peeled her desperate fingers off my jacket. I looked deep into her panicked eyes. "You knew enough, Chloe," I said coldly. "You knew I was freezing, you knew I was starving, and you happily agreed to profit from my destruction. You do not get to claim ignorance just because you refuse to look at the blood on your own hands." I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably on the carpeted floor of the town hall. I walked straight through the crowd of stunned, silent guests. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody whispered any cruel insults. They parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk freely out the heavy front doors and into the crisp, beautiful night air. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away from that toxic town forever. 6 months later, the freezing winters of upstate New York feel like an entire lifetime away. I am standing on the sprawling private balcony of my new Manhattan penthouse apartment, holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee. The morning air high above the city is incredibly crisp and clean. Below me, the bustling streets of New York look like a miniature golden grid glowing in the early sunrise. I take a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the absolute, undeniable scent of pure freedom. I am wearing a soft, warm cashmere sweater and looking out over the magnificent skyline, preparing to board a first-class flight to Europe this afternoon. I plan to spend the next 3 months exploring the ancient architecture of Rome, tasting wine in the rolling hills of Tuscany, and watching the sunset over the Mediterranean Sea. I am living a completely free life without that toxic family dragging me down into their dark, miserable abyss. The $46 million in my private trust has generated more wealth than I could ever possibly spend in 10 lifetimes. But I did not keep it all for myself. I remembered the harsh, lonely days of starving in that log cabin, desperately trying to save my grandfather's legacy. I remembered how impossible it felt to survive an agricultural crisis alone. So I established a massive permanent scholarship fund specifically for agricultural students and independent young women who want to start their own sustainable farming businesses. I wanted to ensure that no passionate, hardworking farmer would ever have to lose their land just because they lacked the financial support of a loving family. My grandfather Henry would have been incredibly proud. As for the people who shared my last name, the universe delivered exactly the kind of justice they had earned. The federal investigation, spearheaded by the relentless Omnicorp legal team, was swift and absolutely brutal. Bradley's arrogant shell company scheme fell apart under the crushing weight of federal scrutiny. He was completely stripped of his law degree, disbarred in the state of New York, and currently faces up to 10 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit real estate fraud and financial extortion. Chloe filed for a messy, highly publicized divorce, trying to salvage her own reputation, but she was forced to sell her luxury cars and designer clothes just to pay off the massive legal debts Bradley left behind. My parents, Richard and Barbara, suffered the exact fate they had planned for me. The enormous legal costs of defending themselves against federal investigators completely drained their pristine retirement accounts. They were forced to sell their pristine suburban house to avoid total bankruptcy. The very same church community that they had manipulated for decades entirely ostracized them. They were stripped of all their charity board positions, banned from the local country club, and treated as absolute pariahs whenever they showed their faces in public. They now live in a tiny, cramped, rented apartment 2 towns away, completely isolated and entirely alone with the bitter consequences of their own insatiable greed. They had tried to destroy my life to line their own pockets, but in the end, they had only succeeded in burning their own entire empire to the ground. I finished my coffee and set the ceramic mug down on the glass patio table. The morning sun fully breaks over the Manhattan horizon, washing my penthouse in a brilliant, warm, golden light. I think about my grandfather Henry sitting on that old wooden porch, telling me that the land always gives back exactly what you put into it. He was right. I put my blood, my sweat, and my absolute unwavering integrity into that soil, and the universe rewarded me with a life more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. The most valuable lesson I learned through those 3 years of absolute hell is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Blood does not automatically make someone family. DNA does not give anyone the right to abuse, manipulate, or steal from you. We are often taught that we must endure endless suffering just because the people hurting us happen to share our last name. We are told to keep the peace, to be the bigger person to swallow our pain so that greedy, toxic people can remain comfortable in their cruelty. But that is a vicious lie. You have the right to cut off the poisonous branches to protect your own roots. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is an act of essential survival. Walking away from people who actively try to destroy you is the bravest, most beautiful thing you can ever do for yourself. You do not owe your abusers your presence, your money, or your silent compliance. You owe yourself a life filled with genuine respect, safety, and absolute freedom. If my journey from a freezing, starving farmer to a completely liberated, independent woman resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me and helps ensure these stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. Share this story with anyone you know who might be struggling with a toxic family dynamic. Remind them that they are absolutely not alone and that they have the immense power to change their own narrative. And please leave a comment down below letting me know what city or country you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I love connecting with all of you, amazing, strong people from all around the world. Thank you for walking this incredible journey with me. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never let anyone extinguish your light.